Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Zanpakuto. Rain fell down and struck the land in small resounding echoes that originated from tempered steel as turbulent winds wrought havoc across the Hill of Swords. A woman shivered, her mirror-like eyes surveying the world around her. A thin white veil was wrapped around her, the rest of her body covered by layers of flowing blue silk that stretched down to drag over the ground. Her hair was a deep silver, her lips spread in a thin line that stood in contrast to her naturally passive and rounded face. "What is this place?" the woman muttered to herself, raising a hand and watching as the droplets gathered on her palm. It had been a question that had continued to plague her mind without end. This wasn't her home. Her path of perfection. Her name was Kyoka Suijutsu, a Zanpakuto, the weapon of a Shinigami, but more specifically, she was the spirit that represented the sword and ideals of Aizen Sosuke, her master. His was an ideal that sought after perfection, a tranquil world without deficiency like the clear surface of a mirror. Likewise, as his partner, and soul formed of the master's will, she was the same. Therefore, she shivered once more as the once tranquil space she found herself in continued to change itself. The master is sad. It was a common occurrence that even she could easily understand. With the rise and fall of the wielder's emotions, the inner world in which she resides in would change like the coming of a high tide. The rain represented that sentiment of sadness, and even if this wasn't her original master, she still wished for the world to return to tranquility. The stillness of a floating river lily was what she embodied. Perfection was what she sought like her master. A world where others could not bind her. And a world where no one stood above her. This was perfection of a certain fleeting moment where there was truly nothing that could alter and ripple the stillness of her perfect and tranquil world. The rain dampened her hair, droplets racing down her smooth and pale skin, her senses once again alerting her of the numerous stares on her person. Specters, all of them. Their forms were vague with no defining details even on their faces. It could be said that in this world full of swords in which she had entered, only she possessed color and identity. She walked casually across the Hill of Swords, stopping upon a single growing tree in which a sword and sheath lay with the hazy figure of a woman leaning her back against the tree. The specters followed her, discussing quietly amongst themselves as they watched a short distance away. "You are?" the woman by the tree asked, her voice tired, yet regal. She inclined her head before she spoke. "Kyoka Suijutsu," she introduced. "May I take shelter beneath this tree from the rain?" The woman gave a curt nod before freeing some space by her side. Voicing her thanks, she pressed down on her clothes and sat down to rest. Thunder began to resound in the distance, and the woman leaning against the tree pursed her lips before frowning. The specters still around the tree were of similar expressions. "I hate the rain and the thunder," the woman spoke after a moment. She nodded. Any Zanpakuto would, as the weather represents the master's emotions. The pitter-patter of the rain echoed off across the ensuing silence before a specter of a man approached. "You know what we are?" the man asked. "Of course," she answered naturally with a small inflection in her voice. "You, all of you," she pointed around. "Are Zanpakuto, spirits that embody the master's ideals." Maybe, she couldn't help but think. After all, she had never seen so many Zanpakuto spirits in the mindscape of a single individual, let alone what they would represent. As she once stated, each Zanpakuto spirit represents the ideals, or part of the soul of its wielder, and therefore, a frightening thought struck her mind. To contain so many spirits, how many facets and identities did the wielder possess? She shook her head as another specter approached, this time a man and a woman holding hands. "Then why aren't we like you?" they asked. "Why do we not have identity, and are instead shrouded in this dark mist?" Kyoka pondered silently to herself before broaching the question. "It's simple, none of you have yet to call on him. Whereas I have already been recognized by my master," she explained. "As I am now, I would still appear as a specter in front of this new wielder, but at least in here, I know who I am. Thus, my identity is not hidden in the shadows." The specters slowly digested what they had heard before a majority began to wander away and disappear back into their specific weapons, leaving behind only the woman leaning against the tree and the male specter who now carried a red spear tucked around his arm. The male spectre smiled before rudely shoving out his own spot to sit by the tree. She glared at him, but turned her face away when her actions were only met with a devilish smile. What a brute, she mentally insulted him. Say Kyo, the male spectre began. Do you dash? Kyoka, she interrupted with a huff. The male spectre paused for a moment, before shrugging his shoulders. Anyways, Kyo, the male spectre ignored her request. Kyoka's gaze frosted over. Any tips to get recognized by the master? I want to fight already, the spectre complained. Kyoka didn't answer and just crossed her arms instead, earning herself an exasperated sigh from the male. The woman leaning on the tree let out a small resigned smile before deciding to mediate between the two. Kyoka, he didn't truly mean anything by dismissing your request, and in fact is actually behaving quite well based on his violent personality, she explained. She elaborated further by explaining that the male spectre would often pick fights with the other spirits rather than talk at all. The expression of Kyoka's face lightened, but she was still angered and it showed in her voice. Your voice will not reach him as you are now, she said dismissively to the male spectre before gaining an edge of superiority. But I can, as I'm already a fully formed spirit. I can then allow you to transmit your thoughts if I wanted to. Then you'll help? The man asked even while grinning. She didn't answer, and instead directed her gaze up at the clouds. Thus, began the annoyance that was the male spectre. Still though, she wanted what was happening outside with the new wielder to come to an end and return to tranquility. Because amidst the raining sky, large gears began forming, spinning in motion as torrents of fire began to brew. He was furious, of that there was no doubt, but Shiro still made sure to keep a level head. His eyes were trained on the back of the intruder before him. Long blue hair fell down past the intruder's waist, his entire body armored with sleek hollow bone plate aside from his head. From each of his elbows elongated out, were a large and sharp spike. Haribal stood in front of the intruder, and based on the previous discussion between them, he had gleamed that the intruder's name was Grimjo. Haribal's eyes were cold, but he could clearly see the intention to fight within them. However, and unexpectedly, she drew back her sword and alerted Grimjo of his presence behind him. As Grimjo turned around, he finally got a good view of his face. Grimjo had elongated canines, was his first observation, that and an unconcealed bloodlust. Good. Grimjo spoke in elation. It doesn't matter if there are more of you, I'll crush you both. Haribal narrowed her eyes before speaking. You alone will not be enough, she said before standing protectively in front of Sung Sun and Apasai. Grimjo laughed as he understood the meaning of Haribal's words. It was clearly an insult, but her sentence alone conveyed the fact that she was not going to be taking part. One opponent at a time was far more convenient for him unless they were as weak as the previous two Vasto lords. However, based on the power the both of them were exuding, he didn't believe he would be disappointed at all. So, it's you, Grimjo spoke as he got himself into a battle-ready stance facing towards Shiro. Well, let's see how you are going to stop me. Shiro didn't answer and instead leapt a far distance away from Haribal where she was protecting the others. Grimjo quickly followed. As Grimjo's feet gently set down on the sand, Shiro raised his hands and willed for two swords to form, the ones he was most familiar with. A blade of the darkest black, and another of the palest white. Kanshao en Bakia. You are truly an idiot, the voice of a woman spoke in his mind. How can you call out to them without truly knowing what they are? He didn't show any outward change in expression, but inwardly amidst the anger he was feeling towards Grimjo, he was greatly confused. To think that that brute could be so annoying, the woman muttered to herself. He couldn't think much on the woman's voice as the momentary distraction it had caused was enough for Grimjo to land a blow to his face. Spittle flew towards the ground as Grimjo furrowed his brows. He wasn't expecting for his hit to land at all based on the strength and quick wit of his opponent. But still, he wasn't one to think while fighting. He pressed his advantage. Shiro stabbed a blade into the ground to stop his momentum, and quickly bent backwards as sharp claws nearly stabbed into his chest. He grunted as he willed for the formation of 7 swords in the air. Grimjo's eyes widened as he sensed the danger. Those swords, he made them. Shiro willed the swords to shoot down, each flying at breakneck speeds and heavily cratering the sand upon impact. When the dust cleared, Grimjo stood bleeding from his forearms, his arms crossed to defend himself. He spoke, breaking his own rule to never speak in combat. You made these? He asked, staring at the remains of the swords on the ground. At this point he knew it was a rhetorical question, but still he wanted to hear a spoken answer. After all, it was specifically because of these swords that he was quickly able to rise in power, and he didn't want to owe anyone. He fought and shed much blood to possess the bounty of swords he had acquired in the cave using his own power, and now he had just witnessed the sword's origin. Shiro nodded before raising his blades up into a stance. Well shit, Grimjo cursed. If he could turn back time, he wouldn't have used those swords to fuel his evolution. His pride would not have allowed it. His strength should be gained using his own power. Unfortunately, he could do nothing to change anything. Suddenly his eyes gleamed. If he was able to defeat this other Vasto Lord before him, the one who created all the swords, doesn't that mean he had a right to all the swords in the area? He mulled the thoughts over in his head and realized that yes he would. For he obtained the swords using his own power. From this single conclusion, Grimjo's bloodlust skyrocketed, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Shiro, Haribel warned in the distance, sensing the sudden rise in Grimjo's power. Glancing down at Sung-sun and Apasai, she made the decision to move them farther away before she continued to observe. Not even a second after Haribel's warning, Grimjo was on Shiro, attacking with swift kicks and devastating punches that generated shockwaves. Shiro was weaving in between each punch, his arms swiftly lashing out with his blades, yet in close combat both seemed to be even. Each strike he sent was blocked by one of the spiked protrusions on Grimjo's elbows. Will you not call on them? The power of the swords in your hand. The voice of the woman once again resounded in Shiro's mind. He gritted his teeth as he saw an opening and lunged forward towards Grimjo's chest. Once again, he was blocked by the spiked protrusion from Grimjo's elbow. If you truly called their names in spirit, those blade spikes would be nothing compared to the edge of your blade. Call their names? His mind was distracted in the middle of battle, but his body moved on its own to defend against the onslaught of attacks. Roaring, he pushed out with both Kanshou and Bakia and broke apart Grimjo's guard. Zero. The two yelled. Subsequently, the two were forced apart as both of their Zeros collided at the center, producing a large cloud of smoke. Shiro landed with his feet on the ground, his heels digging large grooves in wake of his backwards momentum. Grimjo on the other hand tumbled across the ground before righting himself with an arm and two of his legs spread out. Haribel narrowed her eyes as she watched. From the looks of the exchange, it was Shiro who won out, but even though Grimjo was injured with small burns running across his body, the pressure and bloodlust he was emitting only increased further. Shiro stared across at Grimjo, a thin sheen of sweat coating his brow. Grimjo was nowhere near as strong as Baragan, but the contrast between both of them was what they represented. Baragan was the aspect of time, while Grimjo only seemed to embody sheer aimless destruction. There was no way to truly defeat a person like this and expect them to change their personality so easily. He dismissed Kanshou and Bakia, leaving himself empty-handed as Grimjo quickly appeared at his side with his claws extended. Listen to the voices of those within you, the voice of the woman spoke once again as he closed his eyes to think. Blood for blood. Destruction for destruction. He would face Grimjo head-on using a means the enemy understood most. Trace on. A connection was suddenly formed in his mind, a faint silhouette taking shape within his vision. And with that, a red spear formed within his hands. I was once held by the hands of a witch. The voice that spoke this time was not the woman's, instead it was gruff with the undertones of savagery hidden in between the lines. With the red spear formed in his hands, an intense bloodlust far larger than the one Grimjo was emitting was released. Grimjo momentarily staggered in surprise, but none was more surprised than Haribel, who had never seen Shiro ever emit any sort of bloodlust when fighting an enemy. Even when Shiro fought Baragan, he always did so without giving anything away, but the moment that red spear came out, she involuntarily shivered as her eyes thoroughly inspected the red spear. With a bang, the spear grated against Grimjo's arm, the blade edge digging into his skin. Damn it! Grimjo pushed his arm off and twisted his body to elbow Shiro. The blade spike rushed towards Shiro's chest, but the red spear rose to meet it. At this point, The bloodlust was becoming palpable, the air growing heavy and a sinking fear taking root in Grimjo's gut. Yet who was he to feel fear? He grinned, unexpectedly matching the expression on Shiro's face as he let himself be affected by the bloodlust. I was then held by the hands of a warrior, the voice of the man continued to speak within Shiro's mind. Each word spoken was the signal for a new surge in bloodlust, and an increased drive for destruction. His hands and feet were moving on their own accord, the once hazy image of the man in his vision becoming clearer. No sooner than he realized this fact, he quickly understood that his body was mimicking the actions of the very man in his vision. With the red spear in the man's hand, he seemed to be killing countless soldiers across an imaginary plain. Stab. Sweep. Punch. Every action the man took, his body accurately performed as he was becoming more and more in sync as time progressed. Wounds that did not heal were starting to appear one by one on Grimjo's body, cuts, bruises, and even stab wounds. I am the one who spilt blood upon the plains. Bastard! Grimjo cursed as a cut formed just over his brow. He quickly saw an opening and struck Shiro in the chest, stabbing his claws and dragging them down to gouge 3 deep scars. He grinned for a moment, but quickly clicked his tongue. High-speed regeneration, Grimjo quickly noted as he ducked away from an overhead sweep. He just didn't get it. Shiro's fighting style, it had completely changed along with the need for destruction that suddenly appeared in Shiro's eyes. Ever since he had switched to that red spear, the fighting style Shiro had adopted was far more similar to his own. Brutal and savage. Hell, all of Shiro's attacks seemed to be aimed at the center of his chest. If not for his sheer agility, he held no doubts that any other hollow would have been speared through and died by now. Adrenaline was coursing through his blood, his mind utterly blank except for the compulsion to kill. This was what true battle was like. Live or die, he would regret nothing. Grimjo roared as he once again began his assault. Blood continued to spray in small drizzles from both combatants onto the sand, the pale white becoming a pungent red. I am the bearer of a curse. The means of a sure death. Suddenly Shiro pulled back, spun the spear in his hands, and clipped Grimjo in the jaw, sending him flying up into the air. The sheer power put into the strike letting out a miniature shockwave at the point of impact. Grimjo spat out blood as he flew up in an arc before suddenly getting kicked down back towards the ground. Now, in this moment of violence and destruction, Shiro's arm pulled back from where he was hovering, his eyes dead set on the prone body beneath him as the spear in his hand aligned itself with his line of sight. He cocked his arm, his muscles rippling as he strengthened his grip. Call my name. Gibalg. In that moment, the world became still as the once vague image of the man in front of Shiro's vision instantly cleared. The man turned around and spoke with a laugh. My spear is your spear. From this day forth, we are partners. The sky was instantly blotted in flecks of red, numerous red spears multiplying from one and showering down towards the ground like a carpet bomb. Each exploded upon impact, giving way to turbulent winds that forced Haribel back a few steps, and even caused her to shield her eyes. This was an action she would not have done even if a Zero was blasted in front of her, yet the scope of the damage produced and the backlash caused was not something to take lightly. Even some of the quart-colored trees in the area were uprooted and sent stumbling across the sky. Is this the true extent of your power? Haribel muttered to herself, feeling a tad inadequate and deciding to bolster her own strength. Still, she felt somewhat happy that he was displaying this much power for the sake of a Pasai and Sung Sun, and maybe even herself. That last thought gave her pause, but she quickly thought nothing of the feeling in her chest. She continued to watch mutely as each explosion whittled away at Grimjo's defenses until all the spears exploded at once. The bloodlust was still present in the air, and Haribel found herself once again involuntarily shivering. If she was in Grimjo's place, how would she have escaped? The sheer range of the attack Shiro had just used was way too large to evade it in time. Rather, she would probably do what Grimjo had done and gather all her spiritual power into strengthening her defenses. Up in the air, Shiro surveyed the damage he'd done before slowly drifting towards the ground where he let out a breath of exhaustion. He didn't foresee just how much energy that one attack would expend. Although he had a vague idea about the consumption of the attack, as soon as he'd utilized it with his being resonating with the vague image of the man, the consumption suddenly skyrocketed. He sucked in a breath, and like Haribal, decided to wait for the dust to settle down. Breathing heavily, Grimjo stared up at the dim-lit sky of Hueco Mundo and raised a battered arm out as if to grasp the moon. He wouldn't accept this. He couldn't accept this. Yet the strength and power of that destruction had been enough to overwhelm even him. He grunted as he spat out blood, realizing that life was quickly leaving his body. He glared at that neutral gaze in the distance as his consciousness slowly began to leave him. From there, he suddenly burst into laughter, not caring that the action only served to force more blood out of his wounds. "You bastard!" His gaze seemed to convey what could not be said from his mouth, for at this point he was too exhausted to even speak. "It doesn't matter how you hide it." The crater of sand he was in continued to grow deeper and deeper, the impact of such an attack great enough to punch a hole into the Minos forest that the sand was slowly pouring into, and he along with it. That familiar moment of sheer bloodlust and destruction. "You can't hide it from me. Because after all, beneath that neutral mask." Grimjo closed his eyes as his body began to disappear beneath the sand. "You and I are the same." Shiro watched closely as Grimjo's body fell into the Minos forest, focusing intently on the ever-fading flame of life he could still feel beneath the sand. Moments later, he could feel it no more, and thus he finally turned his attention back to Haribal and the injured. "How are they?" he asked. Haribal laid down her blade and gently inspected both Apasai's and Sung Sun's wounds. "We're hollows," she explained. "As long as we get enough spiritual energy, the wounds should naturally heal with our innate regeneration." He nodded in understanding, and knelt down before laying a hand over both Sung Sun and Apasai. Haribal furrowed her brows, understanding what it was he intended to do. "They're Vasto lords now," she said. "The amount of spiritual energy they'd need to recover their wounds is quite extensive. They can't absorb the spiritual energy of the swords around us as they are unconscious, thus this is the best way. A direct transfer," he said as he began to circulate his spiritual energy into his palms. Haribal's eyes softened before she spoke. "Then let me," she insisted. "I was the one who sent them here, and you have just finished a battle." She could have done it earlier, but she would have had to give up her ability to fight and defend. This was inconceivable in the moments before, as she needed to defend Sung Sun and Apasai from any inadvertent, or misdirected attacks that came in her direction. Now with the danger gone, Shiro had beat her to it. Not taking no for an answer, Haribal quickly placed her own hands on Apchi and Sung Sun and administered a large amount of her own spiritual energy into the two, leaving any energy Shiro wanted to share utterly unnecessary. The wounds on Sung Sun and Apasai began to heal at a visible rate, the influx of spiritual energy triggering a hollow's innate high-speed regeneration. Their complexions soon returned to a rosy hue, as both their breathing became less labored. Haribal stood up after administering her spiritual energy. She staggered for a moment, but quickly righted herself by leaning on her blade. "You owe me one," she ended up speaking indifferently. The fight with Grimjo should have had been hers to avenge Sung Sun and Apasai after all. Even if Grimjo was strong, she was confident that she was still stronger, yet she had conceded her right to battle after seeing the look in Shiro's eyes. Shiro smiled. "I understand," he spoke with a nod. Her lips pulling into a faint smile, Haribal quickly picked up both Apasai and Sung Sun with the strength she had left, and departed toward her resting area, the place where she, Sung Sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai regularly stayed. Left alone, Shiro finally brought his attention on the vague image of the floating woman with her arms crossed before him. Based on her posture, she didn't appear very happy standing next to the clear image of the man in a blue skin-tight bodysuit holding Gi Balg in his hand. The man had short and spiked blue hair. The color of his pupils was red, and his face was square with a narrowed chin. He also wore a pair of long silver earrings on each ear. From the looks of things as Haribal departed, she didn't notice the two even with her keen eyes, therefore he quickly concluded that he alone was the only one who could see them. A savage smile was over the man's face as he happily slung an arm around the floating woman's shoulder. The woman suddenly bristled as she slapped the arm away before giving the man the cold shoulder with a resounding humph of disdain. "Don't be like that, Kyo," the man spoke. "I was just showing my appreciation for the help." "Then do so by never bothering me again," Kyoka spoke. Shiro, who had been silently observing the two interact all along, finally voiced a question. "Who are you two?" The two floating figures paused, before the man stepped up and slung the red spear over his shoulder. "I'm Gibalg," the man spoke. Confused with the answer, Shiro didn't persist, and instead turned his attention on the woman. "Like I've stated before, I'm not so crass of a woman to chase after another man, let alone someone who hasn't earned the right. You may remember my name, but you don't know me for who I am." The woman spoke with a flourish. The man called Gibalg scratched his head before speaking out. "You can just call her Kyo," he explained. Kyoko leveled the hardest gaze she had ever given to anyone, but still deemed it beneath her to personally act. "Still, call me Kyoka," she ended up saying, thoroughly incensed that any more people would begin to simply call her Kyo. Shiro nodded, and didn't know what else to say afterwards. Confused as he was, Kyoko would have none of it as she hastily spoke. "Finished with your business?" she asked, her voice calm and tranquil. It wasn't even that far of a stretch to call it perfect. "If so, then hurry and be rid of the rain." Gibalg nodded. Indeed, the rain makes it hard to do battle, and even then, victory in the rain makes everything quite dreary. Shiro blanked. He really had no idea what these two were talking about. It was then, sighing with exasperation, that the woman gently sat herself down on the ground without wrinkling her clothes. She stared up at Shiro, motioning for him to sit across from her as she subsequently gave shooing motions at Gibalg, who reluctantly faded away from sight. After all, even if he was a tad uncultured, even he could understand that he was in Kyoka's debt, as she had helped him manifest before his master. With Gibalg gone, and Kyoka sitting across from him, Shiro waited patiently for Kyoka to speak. She didn't do anything at first, other than keenly stare at him with a discerning eye, but she eventually sighed before leaning forward on her elbows before speaking. The motion itself could be described as elegant, and even then, it did little to express just how perfect it was. For she was a spirit that reflected the perfection Aizen sought in his own soul. "I am what is called a Zanpakuto spirit," she spoke slowly so as not to confuse any words she was about to say. "Now you better listen closely, because I won't be repeating the words I say again, and don't think I don't know that you're still absently thinking about that hollow that went to the human world." Shiro just scratched his head sheepishly. At least 8 or so nights had passed since Silent had left Hueco Mundo to explore the human world, and she was just about ready to briefly return, but something unexpected had come up. For the past few days, the boy, Ishida, had thought it his responsibility to instruct her on how to use her bow. And thus, she had complied, as she thought the matter to be highly interesting. From the basic stances, to the higher levels of aiming, all were things her body seemed to have already been trained in. In fact, her vast improvements greatly shocked Ishida, who was loath to admit anything about it. These days, he now seemed to wear a conflicted sort of expression on his face. His hands constantly clenching into fists when he thought she wasn't looking. Furthermore, he now continued to train until his hands bled from excessive use. Still, he was making leaps and bounds in his own training, and somehow, she felt happy for him. It wasn't just because his face seemed to remind her of someone, but she was just genuinely happy to see someone who's treated her well improve through his own efforts. Regardless though, his goal seemed to be to surpass her arrows in fire power, or at least be able to match them. In which case, if he couldn't, he had once said that he would match the power of her arrows with sheer quantity. On another note, the unexpected situation occurred when she decided to tail him secretly on the last day before she decided to leave to report back to her friends at Hueco Mundo. It was particularly involving an orange-haired youth that Ishida was quietly watching from afar. He wore a white buttoned polo with short rolled-up sleeves, and a pair of dark blue denim jeans. In his hands was a small satchel that he carried by hanging the handle of the bag over one of his shoulders. She couldn't see his face from her vantage point on top of the roofs of the many houses in the area, but his silhouette alone was enough to send the equivalent of a bolt of lightning smashing into her. She had quickly retreated back into the forest Ishida was having her stay at the time, trying to get her emotions sorted out before doing anything reckless. And thus, was her current predicament. Should she return, or sate the growing need and longing within her? 8 or so days wasn't exactly long for hollows, she reasoned, letting her compulsions win through. Besides, she didn't think she would make that big of a deal even if she stayed for a month. She nodded her head. Regardless of anything, she needed to make sure that she returned with answers. Therefore, after practicing with Ishida again on the following day, she quickly began tailing him once more in hopes of running into that orange-haired youth. What she didn't seem to understand at that moment, however, was the attention she was bringing to herself every time she left the riot-suppressant properties of the forest Ishida used for training. Particularly, the black cat that immediately put aside what it was doing previously to quickly vanish in the direction of a particular candy shop. But that was a matter she could care less about. Her hopes of the day were not in vain as Ishida once again decided to observe that orange-haired youth. However, this time when Ishida left, she decided not to follow him, and instead remained to observe the orange-haired youth. She could feel her blood pulsing, her mouth suddenly going dry as she leapt from building to building, sometimes streetlights. All the same, her attention was always on the back of the youth, watching as he bickered with the raven-haired girl walking by his side. The girl was wearing the same buttoned polo the youth was wearing, but it was more of a targeted design towards females as a red bow-knot ribbon was tied around the collar. Different from the youth wearing jeans, the girl wore a skirt. Oddly, there were moments where the two seemed to quiet down, and the girl would look in her direction holding a blinking device, although each time she would simply duck out of sight. Other than that, the youth and the girl walked to the front of a small building, half clinic and half house. She quietly made her way to stand on the roof, the feeling of déjà vu she felt upon seeing the home still yet to leave. Slowly, she lowered her head to glance into the window at the front of the house, watching quietly as the girl the youth was bickering with made her way to seclude herself inside the youth's closet. For some reason, she felt that fact alone was a tad weird, but ever since she'd come to the human world, a lot of things didn't make much sense. As for the youth, he wasn't in the room at the moment. Nodding her head, she decided to continue her observations in the following day. She jumped down onto the ground in front of the house before taking a few steps away. By now, Ishida should have arrived back at the forest, and would probably begin looking for her if she didn't return soon. As much as she might enjoy watching him run around the town looking for her, she still didn't feel like troubling Ishida, who had been nothing but courteous towards her. After all, he even bought her a change of clothes to wear after mentioning that a lady shouldn't wear such revealing clothing. Therefore, she was wearing a white t-shirt with a flaming skull depicted at the center, and jeans that fit perfectly around her legs. Walking away, she paused briefly for a moment and turned her attention back on the clinic, frowning, before she left in a hurry, feeling as if something was twisting her gut. In her haste, she didn't hear the choked gasp and the shattering of glass as she left. Nor did she slow down when the clinic's door was roughly kicked open and a desperate pair of eyes lingered in the direction of her departure. Chapter 12. As soon as Brands woke up, he felt extremely tired, his body in a great deal of pain. However, he was a smart hollow and he didn't know where he was and what had happened. Therefore, as soon as he woke up, he didn't move and instead used his eyes to survey his surroundings. At least one advantage of still being an Ajichas was the mask on his face. Even for a Shinigami, one would not know if a hollow with a mask was awake or not. They simply had no eyelids to blink. Still, if there was one thing he was sure of, it was that he had managed to get away. The room he was currently in had no roof, only 4 walls that covered him on either side, yet that alone was enough for him to confirm something. He was back in Hueco Mundo, the moon in the sky, and the feel of the environment was uncanny. Then why hadn't he been eaten? He held no notions of how life was like for hollows outside of his king's domain. It was a world of eat or be eaten, and with his condition he wouldn't have been surprised if he woke up within the consciousness of another hollow. Clearly, this was not the case. Even as he lay motionless, he couldn't feel his arms, let alone work up enough energy from his legs to carry himself out of here. Still, he didn't remember 4 walls around him before he passed out, so he must have had been moved. "I know you're awake, hollow," a clear voice spoke before a hollow appeared at the entrance of the room. "You're lucky Lord Baragan has spared your life," the hollow sneered before tossing the remains of another hollow before speaking again. "Eat." He was stunned for a moment. "Baragan," he ended up saying. The hollow didn't answer, and instead turned to leave without another word. He didn't call after him, nor did he even move for that matter, too caught up in his own disbelief. Of all the hollows, he knew that would have helped him in his situation, Baragan was definitely not one of them. In fact, he considered Baragan far too dangerous to even approach. Noticing that the hollow had left, it was only then that he decided to prop his body up. Some of his wounds spouted blood, but he knew that as long as he could consume some spiritual energy, the self-healing that all hollows possessed would immediately begin the process of recovery. He had lost his arms, which made balancing a tad harder in a sitting position, but at least he had his wings to act as propping stands. He grimaced. That Shinigami was ruthless. The amount of spiritual energy required for a hollow to recover one's arms was exponential, and thus most hollows would have no chance to recover, and instead had a higher probability of getting consumed and assimilated by another. However, he didn't worry about that particular matter. After all, what was spiritual energy when his homeland was literally drowned in it in the form of swords and weapons? Staring at the offered remains of food the hollow had given him, his eyes turned disdainful. There was no point in eating another hollow for power. To him, all that would entail was having another consciousness in his soul fighting for dominance like many of the other hollows in Hueco Mundo and the Minos Forest. It was entirely ineffective and would only serve to hinder him. Besides, the swords in his king's domain were far more effective, looking just alone at the number of Ajichas and new Vasto lords in the territory. It was natural that he didn't even bother eating. Instead, he pulled from the meager amounts of spiritual energy he had been able to gather while he was asleep and forced it down to his legs. With the power provided, he staggered onto his feet and made his way out of the room. He had never been to Baragan's kingdom, and as such was unfamiliar with the structures of the area. It was like a large maze with open rooms and tall spiraling spires with small pathways that bridged the gap between them. Internally, he was criticizing the surroundings as he went, since nothing in his mind could ever compete with his home. He quickened his pace. How long had he been incapacitated for? It was the only question running through his mind. Thinking clearly, from what he remembered of that Shinigami, Kisukura Hera, he would not let Silent go if she was discovered. And that reason alone was more than enough for him to strain himself to report back to his king. Still, he suddenly froze in his wandering when he stumbled upon a court of hollows, more importantly when his eyes landed on a figure sitting on a throne of bones. "Ah, the little bird has woken up," Baragan spoke. Baragan, he addressed curtly with only a slight nod to show some respect to a hollow of Baragan's power. However, he would never bow to someone other than his king. Baragan took note of this and only grunted. "You belittle me over that silent idler you call a king." He didn't respond, and just stared indifferently. Live or die, it was Baragan's choice, and the fact that Baragan had already once allowed him to live meant that he wouldn't kill him now. Baragan crossed his arms and stared before he let out a breath. "Your loyalty is admirable," he spoke. He once again didn't say anything, but he completely understood what Baragan had meant. If it was any lesser hollow, they would have long since bowed and did their utmost to please Baragan to increase their chances of survival, yet he was different. "Go then, and tell that king of yours that he owes this mighty one a favor," Baragan said as he directed the hollows in his court to part like the Red Sea. A path out of Baragan's domain was opened before him, with rows of hungry hollows aligning either side. Yet none dared attack him, for Baragan had allowed him to go, and Baragan's word was law. He stumbled forward, but immediately caught himself. Thinking about the distance from his location back to the king's domain, a shudder traveled down his back. He really didn't know if his body could hold out, and even when Baragan had noticed, the prideful king never said anything about it. His will and devotion was his only motivation. He steeled himself before he gave one last look at Baragan, who sat leaning his head on the back of his hand. A moment passed, and then two, before he spoke to Baragan. "You have my thanks," he said quietly. Limping, he walked out of Baragan's kingdom with only a single goal in mind. He needed to return home. Shiro sighed as he tried to communicate with the Zanpakuto spirits Kyoka had told him resided within his inner world. The results, however, were once again the same. No matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to work. The only spirits he could currently communicate with was Kyoka Suijutsu, who chose not to respond, and Gibalg, whose only concern seemed to be when the next fight came. In short, neither of the two were being helpful. As for Kyoka's lack of response, it may very well be due to one matter that greatly confused her. He was a hollow, yet he still possessed an inner world. Inner worlds were spaces within one's soul that for Shinigami, housed their Zanpakuto spirits. Hollows just didn't have it, and instead possessed an emptiness in their souls caused by the termination of their soul chains, anchors that had once tied them to their physical bodies. However, he alone seemed to possess an inner world. It was a testament to the spirits he seemingly held within him. "Are you all right?" Nell asked. "I'm fine," he spoke. "I was just thinking about a few things." Nell nodded before she began to explain the purpose of her visit. After Haribel had a discussion with Nell, she had then since become accepted by the rest. Today, she was currently present due to matters regarding living arrangements. After all, she and her group were the newest Hollows to settle in, and were now in need of a place to stay within the region without disrupting anyone else. Haribel and her group had laid claim to the south, Starkey and Lilynet to the north, and the east and west were inhabited by the other Hollows. "I see," he said as he pondered silently to himself. "Starkey and Lilynet live in a large area, and I'm sure Lilynet wouldn't mind having more company nearby." Nell smiled. "That could work then," she said. "Now all you have to do is ask them," he spoke. "Right now?" Nell raised a brow. "Yes, well, Starkey is right there," he pointed out. Starkey was motionless, lying down on the sand by a large boulder. If he wasn't pointed out, it would have been hard for anyone to have taken notice of him since he was also suppressing his spiritual energy. "Well, Starkey?" he asked. "I don't care as long as she can distract Lilynet," Starkey said. "You're hiding away from her, again, aren't you?" he inquired. Starkey didn't answer, but at least he had consented to Nell and her group's presence in his area. "Pesha," Nell called to her friend. Of her companions, the only one who had accompanied her today was Pesha since Dodo Chukka and Bawa Bawa were busy looking for other places. "Yes?" Pesha asked. "I need you to find Dodo Chukka and Bawa Bawa, and tell them to move to the north," Nell said. Pesha quickly agreed, and with a nod, he soon left. Nell then turned her attention back to him. "Thank you," she spoke. He accepted her thanks, and went back to what he was doing before, trying to communicate with his Zanpakuto spirits. However, he spotted something in the distance. The places he normally spent his time at were all highly elevated. This was in part due to his duty of warding off dangerous Hollows before they could enter the land near him, and disrupt those using him for shelter. As such, vantage points were a must. In this case, he spotted a figure in the distance. The figure was in a sorry state. Wounds covered the figure's body from head to toe, and even then, most of them were bleeding from overexertion. "Brands." He stepped forward and appeared by Brands' side within a single bound. His facial expression promptly turned blank. Not only was Brands injured, but he had also lost his arms, and appeared to be fading in and out from consciousness. "Brands." He spoke. The last he remembered seeing Brands was when he had asked him to watch over Silent. His eyes narrowed. If Brands was like this, then what of Silent? Brands stared up at him with tired eyes, before recognition dawned. I have failed you," he spoke with a wheeze of his breath. "What happened?" he asked as he supported Brands. He knew that something was wrong when he had heard no word about Silent's situation. With Brands' personality, he would have had reported back to him within a week at most. Brands tried to speak, yet his body began to strain under the burden of his long journey from Baragan's kingdom. Therefore, he only spoke the words that were most relevant. "Human world, Shinigami, Kisyuk, Urahara, Silent, Dan. Ger." With that said, Brands fell silent as he coughed out blood and fainted. "Shiro?" Nell asked from the side as she and Starkey arrived. He didn't respond straight away, and instead handed Brands over to Nell. "Take him back and let him rest," he spoke. Nell nodded, but didn't leave as she was curious of something. Starkey was the one who voiced his opinion. "Will you need help?" he asked. Instead of answering, he raised his arm, and cut open a large gargantua with a flick of his hand. "I'm going to the human world to search for Silent," he said, placing his arms back by his side before walking towards the void. "I would appreciate help in finding her." "In that case, I should give you some advice," a voice spoke. He paused in his steps, Nell suddenly glaring as she recognized the sound of the voice. Only Starkey gave no outward reactions aside from straightening his back, but even then, it was hard to tell with him. It was either the voice had caught him off guard, or Lilynet was nearby. Still, the crux of the matter was the appearance of a certain Soul Reaper. Eisen Saushik. Eisen, Nell spoke cordially. Did you not remember your own promises? She was referring to what Eisen had agreed to the last time he had left. Specifically, how he was to notify others of his presence. Eisen smiled knowingly. Is that not exactly what I have done? He reasoned. After all, no one else knew that he had arrived at this location in Hueco Mundo. His appearance in front of Shiro was his first in a while, so it could be said that he was indeed living up to his promises. Nell looked like she swallowed a bitter pill, but nonetheless, she had no words to refute Eisen's reasoning. And what advice do you have to give? He asked a tad impatiently. Only he knew that the longer he waited, the worse the situation could become in the human world. Kisukura Hara. He clenched his fists. Naturally, when Eisen had first told him of this name, he had felt nothing of it, but he supposed that was his mistake, and Brands was the one who suffered for it. Brands was strong, yet even someone of his strength was defeated. Based on the wounds, his impression of Kisukura Hara only grew worse. After all, someone like him could tell that the injuries inflicted weren't fatal, but rather to inflict the most pain. It's fairly obvious what this Kisuk had in mind, Kyoka suddenly spoke from within his inner world. He wanted this Brands character to flee. Why else would he wound him yet not kill him, or question him? His body tensed after hearing Kyoka's words, and soon after, his gaze landed on Eisen. Speak, he spoke, his words sounding like a command in his haste. Eisen thought nothing of it, and wiped the sand off of his hakama. The Soul Society has people from the 12th Division in charge of technology and spiritual tool development monitoring the presence of hollows within the human world, Eisen said as he pushed up his glasses. Should an Ajicha's level hollow appear, Shinigami can be immediately notified and dispatched. Now what do you think would be the appropriate response if a Vasto Lord level hollow appeared? Eisen didn't give anyone the chance to speak as he continued. Not only would the Soul Society deploy Captain-level Shinigami like myself, but if more than one Vasto Lord-level hollow appeared, they could even deploy full divisions. That is after all how devastating a Vasto Lord's power can be. That's where I can come in and intervene, he said. And how would you do that? He asked, the Gargantia closing behind him. I can send you all quietly one by one to the human world so that the Shinigami will not detect the presence of a Gargantia. From there, it's up to you to mask your own spiritual energy, Eisen explained. And why should we trust you? Nell asked as she shifted Brands' weight on her shoulder to alleviate some of the discomfort in her position. You are a Shinigami yourself. Is this not just some plan of yours to hinder our strength and deal with us one by one? Eisen laughed good-naturedly. You would be correct in your caution, but I assure you, I do not hold the Soul Society in a very high regard. Why else would I be in Hueco Mundo? He said. The words Eisen spoke caused a fleeting look of surprise to flash across Nell's face, but she was quick to hide such things. Pretty words are all you are, she said while turning her gaze away. Thinking on the content of Eisen's words, everything said did seem plausible. As for whether or not he trusted the man, did he even have any other choice at the moment? Go on, he said, turning his body to fully face Eisen. Gladly, Eisen said before he placed a hand within his hakama and pulled out a box containing a black orb. I'd like you all to turn your attention to this device I have created. It will be able to send you right to the human world without triggering the alarm system the 12th Division has meticulously set up. Of course, it will take me a few moments to construct it up accordingly. That doesn't matter, he spoke. I'm more concerned about where this device of yours will open up at. Eisen nodded. True, I do recall you saying you were going to look for someone in the human world. No problems, it shouldn't matter much as long as I set the device up where this friend of yours opened up their Gargantia, Eisen explained. Gargantias were tunnels between dimensions, and very often, one would leave a trail behind after opening one as it takes time for the holes in the dimension to mend. Then I will have to trouble you, he said thankfully. The pleasure's mine, Aizen said cordially. You need only show me the way. Well then, if things are like this then I'll take this guy back for now. Stark said as he yawned, and then turned to Nell before he took brands off her shoulders. Call me when you need me. I'll be taking a nap while I wait for this guy to wake up. Everything appeared to be moving accordingly. Aizen stared off at the lands around him as the Vasto of White led him towards a specific location. What caught Aizen's attention the most, however, was the simple realization that he could not spot a single Jillian level hollow or lower within this land of swords he was walking through. It was absurd, bordering on incredible. With the way he knew how Hueco Mundo functioned through his own research, there was little to no means for such a land like the Vasto of Whites to exist. Take for example the Minos Forest. The hollows there all varied in power levels, strengths, and intelligence. However, none but a few of them were in the same state of evolution. After all, the stronger a hollow in the Minos Forest was, the greater their need to feed on others. This need would drive them to further acts of cannibalism, thus reducing the potential of other hollows reaching the same level. Is this the place? He asked as the Vasto of White stopped near a small ridge. Before the Vasto of White could speak, however, he was interrupted as a childlike hollow he hadn't seen in his last visit suddenly appeared. Shiro! The childlike hollow exclaimed. Have you seen Stark? I swear he's hiding from me, she pouted. So, his name was Shiro? He noted it down for later use. Shiro sighed before opening his mouth. Now's not the time, Lilynet, he spoke. Lilynet frowned before her gaze landed on him. What are you doing here? Her voice sounded accusing. He felt his brow twitch. Ignorant child. Lilynet, Shiro warned. Clicking her tongue, Lilynet backed off and decided to watch from a distance. Shiro then prompted him to begin constructing his device. The device he was constructing currently had no name, but it didn't really matter. All that did, was the device's function. Unlike a Garganta which proceeded to literally tear a hole between dimensions, this device utilized aspects of what Shinagamis used in their own dimensional crossings called Senkaimon. The Senkaimon that the Shinigami used were pre-made dimensional holes, which was why when they opened they did not disrupt the dimensions and form fissures and cracks in the human world. Naturally, for something pre-made, each Shinigami required a guide in the form of a hell butterfly to avoid the countermeasures the Soul Society had taken to prevent others from using their same passageway. The passage itself was called the Danga, and the countermeasure was called the Kotosu. Still, the aspect his device took from the Senkaimon was the utilization of a pre-existing tier. Which is why he had used his words to instruct Shiro to bring him back to where a Gargantia was originally opened. As he worked, he didn't realize until later that the noise he was creating to set up the device had brought him to the attention of the other hollows passing by. However, one word from Shiro was enough to keep them quiet and at bay. Soon, Lilynet got bored with just watching and decided to inspect everything herself, her presence going unnoticed due to the importance of the situation. Besides, to her, inspecting was far better than staring at sand. Eventually, she became transfixed on the black orb-like object being emitted from the device. It's done, he spoke, getting Shiro's attention. Shiro nodded before stepping forward. Thank you, he said. The other hollows around seemed to have conflicted expressions flash across their faces, but he supposed it was natural. Shiro was their leader, and a hollow himself, yet here he was thanking a Shinigami. I know I didn't misjudge you. Elusive and cunning, Nell spoke with a frown. She had followed closely behind him ever since Stark had left. But your current behavior is making me think otherwise. He only smiled on her commentary, not willing to divulge or admit anything. Shiro was more straight to the point. How does it work? He asked. Perfect, he thought to himself before explaining. The device was set up in a small formation shaped like an upright square window. Metal widgets were spread evenly across the surface, and in the middle, was a small condensed pool of spiritual energy to act as a power source. To use it, one would only need to activate it through the orb-like activation switch, and the device would naturally draw the person in. Then I'll be going first, Shiro said as he stepped forward. Of course, he agreed. However, at that moment, everyone just froze. because the first to go was coincidentally someone that no one had expected. Huh? Eh? Lilynette starred in befuddlement as the hand she had used to touch the black orb began to pull her body towards the center of the sphere. Wait, hold on. She yelled, trying to force herself out. Meanwhile, everyone else including Shiro was staring at her incredulously. Even he appeared to be a tad taken aback, as he had planned for the first individual to go through the gate to be a Vasto Lord. Preferably Shiro, but his plans would have been fine as long as he was able to send a hollow even remotely strong enough through the dimensions. But this? He immediately began to rework his plans to salvage everything. At least he could rely on Jinichi Maru, one of his most trusted subordinates, to send a Jillian across. You idiot! Lilynette yelled as the orb expanded and her body was nearly completely enveloped. Where are you when I need you? And with that, Lilynette disappeared. A week had passed since Silent had returned back to where Ishida was training. In the past few days, she had also been training with him. Nonetheless, everything Ishida would teach her were things she seemed naturally able to do on instinct alone. Things like forming a bow in her hand, gathering spiritual energy from the environment, and creating spiritual arrows to fire at targets, all were completed with little effort. It was a fact that only served to make Ishida train even harder, yet today something just seemed off about him. Not once did he smile during his training, and instead he was palming an object he kept concealed in his hand. Still, she was thinking about other matters. Over the course of the week, she had been constantly returning to that particular clinic, and each time she felt more and more confused with herself. For personal matters, she avoided looking at anyone else who came into the house ever since the first time she had taken a good look at that orange-haired youth. It felt as if something was clawing at her from the inside, an unbearable pain spreading across her body, only made worse when she had once spotted him in the city in a black hakama wielding a giant sword. It was then that she decided not look at anyone else within the house clinic for fear of even greater pain. She didn't realize it, but her hands were trembling. There was just something about this city, and the people who lived within it. She felt lost, unsure of what to do, and that uncertainty is what clouded her judgment. What was right and what was wrong? She knew that she should have returned back to Hueco Mundo long ago, and yet she was anxiously waiting for Ishida to finish his day's training just so that she could once again sneak out. Karakura. This place, this town, it seemed to hold something dear to her, a deep desire engraved even within her own consciousness. Even if she wanted to return to Hueco Mundo, she knew that unless she solved her problems now, she would only end up coming back to this town again. Besides, if she returned, she wouldn't even know the next time she would be able to come back to the human world. Remember, stay here for now, especially today, Ishida warned just before he left. She remained still, not promising anything since she already had plans to leave. Frowning, Ishida didn't say another word before leaving in a certain direction. Waiting a couple minutes, she then promptly left in the direction of the town. Only two things were going through her mind at that moment. Two choices to be exact. Either go back to the clinic again, or travel through town. Both options were compelling to her, as no matter how many times she visited the clinic, she'd never get tired of just looking at it. As for the town, wandering around always brought her a sense of familiarity. However, 2 or 3 hours later, she could do neither as she spotted an abnormality in the distance. A hollow? She wasn't sure because she was used to seeing only Ajich's level hollows or higher back at Hueco Mundo within the Hill of Swords. Still, it had a mask over its face, and that was more than enough of an indication. She steadied her breath and formed a bow in the manner Ishida had taught her. She didn't know if she was a hollow or not, but the point was, she didn't feel any guilt as she let loose a spiritual arrow. Perhaps, if she was killing a fellow hollow in the king's domain she would hesitate, but she had heard stories from her friends about the other hollows living outside the king's domain. The arrow soared across the air before instantly piercing through the hollow in her sights. Moments later, the energy within the arrow burst, and rendered the target into nothing, its screams quickly dying out as the human it held in its hand fell back towards the ground. Still, she didn't pay much attention to it anymore, but rather her eyes widened as she looked at a sky completely filled with them. What was going on? She had been in Karakura town for the better part of a few weeks now, and she'd never encountered other hollows. Yet today, so many of them were present. Currently in the course of her wanderings, she found herself in one of Karakara's busiest streets, the shopping district. Many people were walking down and about, others entering shops, and some just standing idle and talking with friends. That's not what she cared about or focused on, however. The hollows around and infesting the place was what drew her concern. There were too many hollows in the area, and even if they weren't attacking anyone yet, all it would take was a single step from some of the larger ones to end a life. Thus, it was too dangerous to keep them here. She sucked in a breath before firing an arrow potent in spiritual energy. The arrow itself was like a beacon that drew all of the hollows' attention. Subsequently, all their gazes landed on her, still holding her bow in hand. A shiver ran down her back staring at the sheer number of them, but she didn't hesitate when it came to finding a more isolated fighting ground. Drawing them away from the people at the shopping center, she ended up at a soccer field adjacent to a kids' middle school. Apart from a few kids she could vaguely see running in the field, no one else seemed to be in the area. Still, she didn't want to risk fighting here. Wait. She narrowed her eyes, spotting a hollow in the middle of the field about to attack the group of kids. Damn it. She pulled up her bow to shoot the hollow down, but was instead forced to fire at the horde at her back as some of the faster ones drew too close. Each shot fired ended a hollow's life. Sweat dripped down her brow, as exhaustion began to take its toll on her. She didn't know how many hollows she'd already killed, but their number just didn't seem to be ending. Even worse, she couldn't get away from the area as she had been completely surrounded. Still, what concerned her the most was that she had lost track of the hollow on the ground within all the commotion. Were the children safe? She didn't know. Suddenly, spittle flew as a hollow unexpectedly blindsided her, and sent her flying towards the grounds of the soccer field. With a crash, she quickly realized that she'd unexpectedly landed on someone. It was a tall and well-built man who appeared to be of Hispanic descent. He had shoulder-length brown hair which was curly at the ends, and bangs that covered the majority of his face aside from his nose and chin. What surprised her, however, was the abnormality of his arm. It seemed to be completely encased in a black armor of some kind. The only other thing that she quickly took note of was that the man was hurt, blood running down from his head and staining his clothes. "Are you all right?" the man asked through labored breath. She nodded, but her attention was elsewhere on the hollows hovering just above them. This was why she didn't notice the only other person nearby, a black-haired girl in a t-shirt with a singlet over top. Her face was square with a narrowed chin, and she didn't appear to be any older than 15. If one looked closer at the scene, they would have been able to see that the black-haired girl seemed to have completely froze, her eyes widening in disbelief as a hand came to rest in front of her mouth. Still, all of this went unnoticed. "You are the one all these guys are chasing?" the man asked. Once again, she absently nodded her head. She had been able to lead all these hollows to chase after her due to the purity of the spiritual energy she had within her. Still, there was no way she would get others involved. Which was why she pushed away from the man and promptly left as she reformed her bow, the hollows quickly chasing hot on her heels. By that time, the man noticed that the black-haired girl had collapsed onto her knees and moved to help her, yet the black-haired girl swatted the man's hands away before wordlessly staggering to her feet and giving chase. Back with Silent, she had reached the forest where she had first met Ishida. In fact, it was one of Ishida's training grounds. Hiding within the trees, she then began to shoot her arrows, killing hollow after hollow. At times, they would draw close to her, but this was precisely why she had chosen this area. Maneuvering around their strikes, she disappeared into the foliage and resumed her onslaught of arrows. At Hueco Mundo, her sparring partners normally involved Ajicha's-level hollows. Therefore, when she isolated these regular hollows within the forest, it was relatively easy to defeat even their large numbers from a distance. True, she could have done it anywhere with her strength, but then she would risk the danger of getting blindsided once again. Looking across the trees, her expression lightened. For some reason the hollows' numbers seemed to have dwindled from the last time she took notice. Soon after, none were left as she shot forth her last arrow. In that moment, she blinked her eyes, spotting something on a distant branch of a tree. How odd, it was that black cat she had seen before. Thinking clearly on the matter, She actually had been seeing this cat a lot in the previous weeks since she's been exploring Karakara town. Often following her at times before quietly slinking away when she wasn't paying attention. Yet what was it doing here? Currently, it had used her moment of pause to walk up to her, brushing up against her legs while meowing, its fur feeling quite smooth. She knelt down and began to pet it, letting out a laugh when the cat rolled onto its back and insisted on its stomach getting a rub. Sadly, she shook her head to show that she didn't have the time. Many hollows were still present in the town, and it would be best to eliminate them before they devoured any more humans. However, the cat meowed once more before standing up on its feet and swishing its tail. It soon began to walk in a certain direction, pausing as it turned and looked at her. Did it want her to follow? She shook her head, and walked away back towards Karakara town. Now wasn't the time. Thanks for reading and thank you to my newest patron, Chanel. Patreon.com/Parcasius. Next update, Fate in Time. Short story idea by Archer McMuffin, The Daily Life of a Reluctant King, Part 1. In the Vasto of White's domain, there were no set rules, but there had always been some sort of underlying pact between the hollows of Ajich's level. Hollows who had recently evolved from Ajichas to Vastolords were still in the know, while other Vastolords like Starkey and Haribal were kept in the dark about this growing secret society and its policies. The growing fanatical devotion to one being, and the emergence of a possessiveness that even the leaders of the society did not know about. Then again, most hollows had lost any notion of emotion long ago after their human counterparts met with death. Therefore, the feeling of possession was not something they knew, yet that didn't mean that they didn't act on it. It was why on this day, Shiro felt a cold chill travel down his back as he stared at the three newest Vastolords approaching him. Sung Sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai. Normally, this trio of hollows would never so casually approach him when they were Ajichas, but now they had become Vastolords. Since he never placed any sort of rules in the land he protected, the hollows within had made their own. One of them being that one was not worthy to approach him unless they were qualified enough. Naturally, it was why none of the hollows in his domain raised a fuss when either Starkey or Haribal came to speak with him. Other than Brands, who was well respected, no other Ajichas dared approach lightly in fear of some sort of retaliation by the rest. What kind of retaliation and who headed it, he didn't know, but it was a matter that he had never questioned. But it was also a matter that he had taken for granted. Recently Starkey had been coming to find refuge from Lilynet, but Lilynet would often follow and instigate Starkey to spar with him. This was evident from the massive explosions of numerous Ceros, and the destroyed land. Based on this recent activity, he concluded that the three approaching him were going to ask him for a similar matter. Apasai strode forward, looking confident, yet Mila Rose blocked her, and they both immediately began arguing. Sung Sun then took the lead, only for the other two to grab her by the shoulders and force her back. Cursing and butting heads with each other, the three somehow arrived 15 feet away from him at the same time, yet before they could even speak, a brat showed up and ruined everything. "Oi Shiro, you said you'd hang out with me today," Lilynet called from the distance as she crossed her arms and absently kicked the ground. Starkey's still being an ass. "Tough luck, we were here first," Apasai quickly argued, crossing her arms. Indeed, Sung Sun spoke with a flourish of her hair. "In which case, a child like you serves no purpose aside from being an annoyance." She then made shoo-shoo gestures. Lilynet's lip twitched before she erupted with an explosion of profanities. "You all, who do you think you are?" she yelled. "I've been here the longest, so that makes me more important than all of you." Mila Rose grunted before saying, "Words of a brat." Lilynet growled, pouncing straight at Mila Rose, who simply held her off at arm's length. "See," Mila Rose laughed. "A simple brat. You think he'd rather spend his time with you?" Lilynet argued. "Of course not. He'd rather spend time with Lady than a brute," Sung Sun said evenly. "Then tough shit bitches, you can leave now," Apasai said smugly, leaving behind a trail of dust as she took the initiative. The others blinked. Then Mila Rose and Sung Sun cursed under their breath before following. Lilynet was close behind, but by the time she reached everyone they were already less than 5 feet away from Shiro. "That's enough," Lilynet yelled before glaring in the distance. Starkey, help me! She demanded. In the distance, Starkey was just picking at his ear, and ignored her. I'll remember this, Lilynette muttered before turning her attention back on the competition. Why don't all of you just leave already? Shiro would rather be with me. He wouldn't want to be in the presence of someone who irritates him, Mila Rose spoke, turning her head towards Lilynette. Then who would he pick? Obviously, it would still be me, Lilynette spoke confidently. He'd never choose a brat, therefore, he'd choose me, Mila Rose spoke. How funny, you. Sung Sun muffled her laughter. I'm the better option. Apasai clicked her tongue. A lying snake? Not a chance. At least I'm honest with myself. Silence. Their inquiring gazes then all turned towards him who had been slowly trying to slip away. Well damn. He composed himself, forcing his body to remain still under their gazes. Well he racked his head for something to say. Instead, someone else spoke on his behalf. What is going on here? A calm voice echoed before a figure appeared. Lady Haribel, the three bowed. Lilynette didn't even bother, instead she gave Haribel the stink eye thinking she was trying to interfere as well. Haribel, he spoke with obvious relief in his voice. Finally, someone he could rely on. Haribel stared at the four in front of her with a discerning eye. She had just returned from self-training out in Hueco Mundo as it was the best way to increase her combat experience. After all, if she really had any phrase to best describe this land littered with swords, it would be peaceful. No hollows besides Vastolords would dare invade due to the numerous Ajichas and other Vastolords spread out within the king's domain. Would anyone like to explain? She asked while staring at Sung Sun. Scratching her head, Sung Sun then began to explain. After watching Starkey battle with Shiro in recent days, Mila Rose had gotten the idea that they themselves would be able to spar and grow stronger through combat experience. Listening, Haribel nodded her head, but she was more surprised about another matter. Shiro sparred with Starkey while she was away? If she had known that she could have sparred with Shiro, it would have had saved her the trouble of training outside. Still, she could understand the crux of the current problem. There was only one of Shiro, and four of them. Therefore, they had to decide amongst themselves who Shiro would spar with. She kept silent, pondering over the problem until an unexpected sentence filtered through her ears. But obviously, he'd choose you. Something just shattered inside Shiro's mind, an unknown feeling of trepidation welling up from within him as he discreetly stared at Haribel. She was blank for a moment, before a complex expression surfaced on her face, causing her to glance his way. Coughing into her hand, she turned back to face the four and probed, is that so? Kill me now. Chapter 13, The Start of a Catalyst. His name was Ichigo Kurosaki. A human. He was a boy with spiked orange hair, and a rugged face that always seemed as if he was glaring. Many viewed him in Karakura town as a sort of delinquent due to color of his hair, and his quick temper. Currently, such things hardly mattered. For he was in the black and white garb of a Soul Reaper, or Shinigami. Ishida Uriah was by Ichigo's back, and the both of them were in the midst of battle surrounded by numerous hollows. The entire situation was caused due to the hollow bait Ishida had used as a means to start a competition with Ichigo. I don't see an end to them. Ichigo yelled, cleaving a hollow in half with his oversized sword. It was a flat and standard blade with a square hilt used to prevent attacks to the hands. From a different perspective though, it was identical to the unreleased form of a Shinigami's Zanpakuto. This is quite strange, Ishida muttered. The bait he used should not have been able to draw this absurd number of hollows into one location. In fact, the bait did not possess enough spiritual energy to even tempt this many. Most weaker hollows unable to fend for themselves with just their power alone in Hueco Mundo, turned to the human world as a means to increase their strength. By consuming the spiritual power of the more spiritually aware humans, they could harness that strength and use it as their own. In this regard, hollows were mainly attracted to the human world based on the quantity of spiritual power they could detect. This was why Ishida was growing confused, as not only were the numbers of hollows increasing, but so too was their strength. Guilt began to take root within him. The number of hollows was just too much to be handled without letting a quantity of them escape into Karakura town. From there, it couldn't be helped that innocents would get involved, and maybe some of them could remotely stumble upon the new training partner he had made. Ishida's efforts increased, the quality of his arrows thinning as he chose to focus on quantity. However, because of this, the general power of his attacks was reduced. Ichigo, on the other hand, made up for this. The hollows that Ishida managed to injure, Ichigo would deal the finishing blow. The thought alone that a Shinigami was fighting alongside a Quincy sobered Ishida's mind. This kind of situation had been exactly what his grandfather had been striving for. Ishida's grandfather was the one who taught him the art of the Quincy, unlike his father, who seemed to have had abandoned it. Because of this, Ishida held a great deal of respect and devotion to his grandfather, taking to heart the lessons he was taught and improving himself with them. In this regard, there was no way he didn't know his grandfather's biggest dream. A day where Quincy and Shinigami would put aside their differences and work together to approach an equilibrium of sorts, and obtain an understanding of one another. It was that very dream, though, that led Ishida's grandfather to his death. Holding out by himself against a group of hollows, Ishida's grandfather waited desperately for a group of Shinigami to come to his aid, only for them to come far too late. Since then, the animosity Ishida held against the Shinigami had morphed into bitter resentment, knowing that he was then the last Quincy. That was until that woman had showed up. They aren't stopping, Ichigo clicked his tongue as he landed with back facing Ishida. Got any ideas? Ishida pushed up his glasses and monitored the area around him, his eyes focusing on the largest Gargantia forming in the air. A bad premonition soon took root within him, seeing the hollows at the edge of his vision fleeing back into Hueco Mundo. Hollows were sentient beings, and only a stronger being could force them to run away so openly. Ishida's lack of an answer drew Ichigo's attention. However, it was then that Ishida spoke, a tremble in his voice. In the sky, what is that? Indeed, within the cracks formed from the Gargantia, a massive hand appeared to grip at the very fabric of the world, a lone eye peering in before a second hand emerged and began prying the Gargantia open wider. Khan, the mod soul currently in possession of Ichigo's body, seemed to stagger at that moment. Yet no one's reaction was as telling as Rukia Kukaki, the Shinigami tasked with defending Karakura town. Rukia's eyes were wide open, her mouth trying to form words, but failing again and again as her complexion paled considerably. The hollow bait couldn't have caused this, Ishida tried to deny. Ichigo scowled. There's no use trying to deny anything now. This entire competition between us to kill the most hollows was decided by you, he said. As if agitated by the larger hollow's arrival, the other weaker hollows began to attack in sheer number. Both Ishida and Ichigo prepared their weapons, but a spray of spirit bullets rendered the incoming hollows into nothing. A little girl stood in front of them with a box-like device on her shoulder that rapidly fired shot after shot of spiritual energy, reducing even more of the hollows' numbers down. Not too far off was a little kid wielding a bat which he used to strike down hollows, and near him was a man who killed them barehanded. Had clogs, Ichigo said, lowering his sword. Ishida only raised his guard up after seeing the new arrivals. Kisuke smiled from beneath the green and white patterned fan he kept in his right hand. Now Kurosaki, this isn't the time to be flapping your lips, rather you should concentrate on fighting him while we deal with the rest of them, Kisuke spoke, pointing at the hollow in the sky that had managed to pry open the Gargantia large enough for its head to pass through. Looking up at the giant hollow, it was Rukia who began to explain what it was. Minos Grande, she eventually whispered with her body trembling. It's a gigantic hollow said to be born when hundreds of hollows come and pile together, combining into this monstrosity. Rukia's expression changed. This is impossible, she said. This is the Royal Special Affairs Department's jurisdiction. Kisuke only smiled. It didn't take long before the Minos stepped 1 foot out of the Gargantia. Clicking his tongue, Ichigo charged as Ishida yelled for Ichigo to reconsider, and come up with a plan. Watching from the side, Kisuke didn't give anything away as Yoriyuki silently sat herself near his foot. From the expression on her face, Kisuke could tell that she wasn't exactly in the greatest mood, not after coming back empty-handed. Face calm, Kisuke bent over and picked up Yorichi, letting her rest within the crux of his arm while he began gently fanning himself. Kisuke, you can't be serious. Rukia yelled, rushing forward to help Ichigo. However, Kisuke immediately retrained her using a Kido of some sort. "It will be fine," Kisuke said. "Just leave everything to Kurosaki." Unable to do anything under Kisuke's suppression, Rukia could only watch how Ichigo and Ishida would deal with the current situation. Her heart began to hammer rapidly as the world was dyed red during the Minos' process of creating a zero. "We have to stop it," Rukia urged. "It will destroy everything. Just calm down, Kukaki." "Everything is under control," Kisuke spoke. Naturally, after saying such words, Kisuke still prepared to intercept should something go wrong. However, not only did Ichigo not perish under the doom blast of the Minos, but he had been able to counter-attack and repel it as well. The only trouble came when Ichigo could not properly release his energy and the build-up was beginning to swell his body. Kisuke shared a look with Tessai, his attendant, but ultimately would have to do nothing as Ishida was the one to save Ichigo. The stored-up energy within Ichigo's body was released by Ishida siphoning off the excess power and releasing it into the sky. Yuriuki tapped gently against Kisuke's chest, and smiling faintly, Kisuke then took his group and left. Collapsing on his knees, Ishida took a breather as both Kon and Rukia approached. "Thanks," was all Ichigo said, laying flat on the ground. An odd silence permeated through the air as a great shock shook the area. Rukia's eyes widened as a Gargantia formed beside. Based from the power the rip in space was exuding, she had no doubts that a powerful hollow must have been crossing through. "Ichigo," Rukia said, jumping back and raising her arms to guard. "Oh damn it all," Ichigo grunted as he used his willpower alone to force himself onto his feet. Ishida did much the same, raising his formed bow up with his hands despite the blood dripping down from them. "You idiot." A voice came from the Gargantia before Lilynet dropped down on her ass in front of Ichigo and the others. "What are you looking at?" Lilynet griped. Staring at the clothes Ichigo wore, Lilynet couldn't help but become apprehensive. Similarly, looking at Lilynet, Rukia could feel a shiver run down across her back. If Minos was the lowest level of a Hollow's evolution, then Ajichas and Vastolord were far more terrifying. This being the case, what separated a Ajichas from a Vastolord was the similarity to that of humans and Shinigami. In that regard, what did that make Lilynet who appeared all too similar to a human? The answer caused a cold sweat to immediately spread through her body. She had to warn the others before they did something stupid. Unfortunately, Rukia was too late as Ichigo pointed his sword at Lilynet and cautiously took a step forward. Apprehensive as Lilynet already was, as soon as she saw Ichigo take that first step forward, immediately, a pink zero formed in front of her mouth without any prior warning. Ichigo, Rukia, Kon, and Ishida froze, realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. The Minos that they had just faced required a massive buildup of energy, and a period of time to form its zero, yet Lilynet managed to do it in an instant. Rukia swallowed, her earlier deductions coming to the forefront of her mind. "Don't make any sudden moves," Ishida was the one to whisper. He had noticed something peculiar about Lilynet ever since she had come out from the Gargantia. She was only being cautious. He could tell from her expression, and her clenched fists. Listening to Ishida's words, no one in the group moved, causing Lilynet to frown. Lilynet knew that she wasn't the strongest Hollow, perhaps only able to take on other Hollows at Ajich's level on a good day. Thus, she had always been cautious without Starkane near her to act as a buffer. Seeing that the group of individuals in front of her were not going to make a move on her, she gradually began to dissipate her zero, remembering at least one point in the conversation Shiro had with that Shinigami named Aizen. This point in particular was what had happened to Brands, and why it was Shiro was insistent on visiting the human world. To find Silent. Until then, it would be a very bad idea to draw attention to herself, not knowing if this Kisukura Hera would come out and attack her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity for those present, the zero in front of Lilynet disappeared, a genuinely curious expression on her face. "You aren't going to attack me?" she asked skeptically, scrunching up her nose. The clothes Ichigo wore was a Shinigami's garb, so Lilynet had been preparing herself for a confrontation. "Not at the moment, no," Ishida said, calming his nerves down as he realized that he may just be dealing with a child. Her actions only solidified this point. Seeing the situation unfold in such a manner, Rukia felt as if she had avoided a sword by a hair's breadth. Ironically, she didn't know that if she had teamed up along with Ichigo and Ishida, they may have had a chance at defeating Lilynet since she wasn't the strongest of hollows. It was only her appearance alone, and the description of a Vasto Lord that prevented a physical confrontation. Good, Lilynet beamed, her hands coming to rest on her hips, before a lost expression flittered across her face. To start with, she didn't even know where to begin looking for Silent, let alone how to navigate around Karakura town. Still though, there's a question that we must ask, Rukia said after calming herself. Why did you come to the human world? I'm looking for a friend, Lilynet responded without much thought. She's like me, looks really human too. The expression on Rukia's face faltered before becoming complex. If what Lilynet said was true, then there could potentially be another Vasto Lord class hollow within Karakura town. If one Vasto Lord was enough to fend off a whole division of Shinigami, then what would it mean if there were two? Ichigo laughed. Is that all? Then you should have just said so. We'll help find this friend of yours if you promise to leave straight after. Lilynet crossed her arms. Of course. It's not like the human world is that interesting anyway, she said, yet her eyes were wandering everywhere in excitement, contradicting her words. Scratching his head, Khan stepped forward after a moment before asking the most logical question. Do you have an idea where to look? He asked. Karakura town was a large place, and it would be difficult to search the entire town with just their group alone. Lilynet shook her head before smiling. No idea, she said bluntly. Arriving back home, Ichigo made sure no one was around before motioning both Rukia, Khan, and Lilynet into his room. By now, Ichigo was back into his body, and Khan was stuffed back into the lion plushie that Ichigo had obtained beforehand. As Lilynet did not know where to search, and was not in a hurry to locate her friend, Ichigo, Rukia, and Ishida had decided that it would be best to rest up before proceeding. In which case, the only matter left to be decided was where Lilynet would be staying. As it would turn out, Rukia had decided that it would be best if she watched over her. In this regard, it was natural that Lilynet had inadvertently ended up staying within Ichigo's house. Sitting cross-legged on Ichigo's bed, she teetered on her tailbone, curiously staring at the moving body of Khan, and not saying anything else. You both, stay here for the time being, Ichigo directed. The hollows attracted by Ishida's hollow bait had all been defeated moments prior, and those that remained chose to retreat back into Hueco Mundo. A few of them even staggered upon recognizing Lilynet and fleeing on sight. This only cemented the impression of Lilynet's strength. Lilynet simply nodded as her gaze traveled around the room. The scenery she was used to involved only shades of black and white. In the human world, things were far different. Rukia grunted at Ichigo's words, but felt they were necessary as they couldn't leave Lilynet on her own. Without another word back, Ichigo left his room and entered his living room, which unsurprisingly was empty. It was still the middle of the day and Yuzu and Karen were probably still off at school while his dad seemed to be busier and busier as of late. Sitting down to catch his breath, he was alerted to the sound of his front door opening and then being closed gently. The living room of the Kurosaki household was directly adjacent to its front entrance, which gave Ichigo a good view of who had just walked in. Karen. Ichigo called. Karen was Ichigo's younger sister, and twin to Yuzu. She had black hair parted down the center of her head which exposed her face. However, what caused Ichigo to become concerned was her expression. It was utterly blank. Dismissing the fact that she had returned home early from school, Ichigo didn't bother with such things. Instead, he focused on the state of her clothes. Parts of them were in tatters, and other parts smeared with dirt. What happened? Ichigo instantly demanded, a glare forming over his face. Ichigo, Karen whispered, before wrapping her arms around him and pressing her face to his chest. It was so unlike the Karen Ichigo knew that he just stood there unable to do anything. The Karen he knew was stubborn, and was completely self-reliant. To see her in such a state ignited a fire within Ichigo's chest. What happened? Ichigo demanded again. How long have you known about this? Karen's grip around Ichigo tightened. Known about what? Ichigo asked. Don't lie to me. Karen pulled back from Ichigo, her eyes glistening. I've seen them, those things. And if you knew about them, that you must have had known about her. It was a conclusion Karen had come up to after thinking about just how many things Ichigo was purposely keeping her away from. Ichigo's fists clenched. After hearing Karen's words, he knew with certainty that Karen had encountered one of the hollows drawn in from Ishida's hollow bait. He began to hesitate on a way to answer her. Unlike him, she didn't have a way to combat the hollows, and as such would be put at risk. Seeing the hesitation on Ichigo's face, Karen's expression darkened. "Fine then, don't tell me," she said before walking towards her room, pausing as she passed the portrait Ishine kept of Masaki on the wall. Her hands balled into fists. "I'll find out on my own." Standing by himself near the entrance, he scowled. He nearly yelled when he heard a giggle come from directly behind him. Lilynette had her hands covering her mouth as she tried to muffle her laughs. Rukia on the other hand stared at Ichigo with a brow raised. "I don't see any harm in you telling her," Rukia said after a moment. "In fact, it just might be safer than having her discover things on her own." Ichigo grunted. "It's still too much of a risk," he said. "Why don't you just tell her?" Lilynette asked. "She and Starkey never kept anything away from each other." "It's not that simple," Ichigo argued. "Nothing ever is," Rukia said. Falling silent, Ichigo said nothing else as he realized something at that moment, remembering what he had asked of the two. "Why are you both here?" he questioned. "Elsewhere." "Well, this is quite unfortunate," Aizen scratched his head with a rarely heard of frustration in his voice. "That hollow friend of yours seemed to have tampered with something." Tinkering away at the device he had brought, he was subject to the gazes of many hollows. Shiro's was most telling, as even now he desired to go rescue his friends. "How long will this take?" Shiro asked. Aizen calculated the repairs he would be doing, and concluded that it should take at least 2 human days at the least, and a week at the maximum. Shiro creased his brow. "That's too long," he ended up saying. "I could try to shorten the time frame, but when I had first programmed the device, I had set it to send a hollow of great power through. The one that had just passed through was not up to that standard, and as such the device is experiencing a malfunction," Aizen explained. "Then the device doesn't matter," Shiro said. "You're going then?" Aizen asked. Shiro only nodded. Not only would he have to retrieve Silent, but he would have to get Lilynette as well. God forbid what would happen if Starkey found out. "If the king is going, then so too will we," the hollows around all voiced their opinion. "The enemy of the king is the enemy of all of us. Why should the king have to move for such a small matter?" The voices continued to echo out within the lands of the Vasto of White. Aizen's, however, quickly put a stop to it. "If you go, your arrival will only bring more danger," Aizen said. "If my estimate of that hollow's strength that went through is correct, then she should be around in Ajicha's level. This means the only one that could cause her any harm would be Dash." "Kisuke Urahara," Nell concluded, remembering Aizen's earlier words. Aizen nodded. "Indeed, other than him, the Shinigami dispatched into the area are only as strong as the lesser hollows who have yet to even partake in the road of evolution. If you go openly to the human world, not only would the Soul Society get an estimate of your power, but they will send a task force in correlation to your strength," he said. Some of the hollows in the crowd snorted. "Then let them come," they said. "Do you think our numbers are small? Do you think my fellow hollows here are weak?" The eyes of the other hollows lit up as bloodlust filled their beings. Aizen didn't pay them much attention and instead kept his gaze on Shiro. "Then how many lives do you wish to be lost?" Aizen asked. The question silenced the voices of the other hollows. Living alongside their king, they knew of their king's disposition. If just the life of one follower was enough to get him to act, how could he bear sacrificing any more lives? "I alone will be enough," Shiro spoke resolutely after a moment. "If you do so, will you be able to find both of them fast enough before the Soul Society floods the area with Shinigami?" Aizen asked. "Know that when they do so, they have a higher chance of finding your companions first before even you." Shiro furrowed his brows. 2 days, was all Aizen said. 2 days and he'd be able to fix the device. However, in that time span, they had no idea about what would happen in the human world. Such things were only known by Aizen, who was specifically buying time for a reason. Shiro was not affected by the power of his sword, making him the most difficult of opponents. Yet, he thought further, why make him an enemy? Gratitude and debts were powerful tools, but first he would have to set up a suitable situation now that he had to rework his plans. Using Kido, he secretly sent a message to one of his subordinates. It was time to accelerate the capture of the Hogyaku. Thinking quickly, he came up with a suitable setup. Araniro, Ulquiera, he called under the gaze of the hollows around him. From beneath the sand, a large hollow emerged with another hollow with a cracked mask riding on its back. Aizen smiled as he introduced them. The large one is Araniro. The one on his back is Ulquiera, he said. Ulquiera was a sleek and entirely pale hollow. His most discerning feature though was the cracked mask over his face. Araniro on the other hand was an octopus-like hollow with a half-man protruding from the top of its body wielding a trident. As far as a hollow's evolution went, it was close to becoming a Jillian. Lord Aizen, Ulquiera nodded his head. Araniro did much the same, for the majority of his power was garnered through Aizen's help. And what purpose do you have by bringing them here? Nell asked. Aizen smiled without answering her question, and instead met eyes with Shiro. This is my solution if you are willing to hear me out. Shiro nodded. As you can tell, Araniro is not yet a higher class hollow in evolution, therefore it wouldn't draw any alarms if he was to go search for your friends in the human world, Aizen said. Then why should we trust him? One of the hollows in the crowd asked. If it was a fellow hollow in the Vasto of White's domain, then there was no need for questioning, but Araniro did not come from the Vasto of White's domain. Ulquiera, Aizen called. Understood, Ulquiera said, raising a hand to one of his eyes and gauging it out. Ulquiera has a special power, Aizen explained. His eyes can record anything they see, and once crushed, Aizen motioned towards Ulquiera, who crushed the eyeball. A scene of what Ulquiera had witnessed is manifested. Indeed, after the eye in Ulquiera's hand was crushed, a small hazy screen was projected for all hollows to see. Verifying the truth in Aizen's words, Shiro eventually decided to do as Aizen suggested and wait for the device to get fixed while sending out Araniro in the meantime. In the past day, not only did Ichigo notice that Rukia had been acting strangely, but he also noticed that Karen had disappeared when he wasn't paying attention. He scowled, still thinking about whether or not to inform Karen of the situation, yet he continued to put it off. Over the course of the days, Ichigo, Rukia, Chad, Ishida, and Lilynet had been out searching for Lilynet's friend, but had turned out with no results. What instead happened was, like a child's attention span, Lilynet was caught up in the various things she had seen within the town. At times, it was hard to believe that she was still out looking for her friend, but in the end, it was Lilynet who insisted in continuing to search. Night had fallen unknowingly, and the group had then dispersed. Laying on his bed in the middle of the night, Lilynet was taking a short nap, her breaths coming out slowly. Quite honestly, whenever he looked from any angle, even if she was a hollow, she didn't appear to be any different from the younger brats of the neighborhood. Even her actions were similarly childish, her eyes lighting up after the first time she saw a television through the windows of a shop. Sighing, his mind then wandered back onto the topic of his sister, Karen. She had arrived home moments earlier, and she had gone directly into her room after sparring Yuzu a small glance. His father though had yet to return, but it was normal since he worked as a doctor. Staring up at the ceiling, he remained still, yet his mind still wandering. It was an hour later that he heard a creaking noise originate from his closet. If one were to ask what he kept in his closet at the moment, it would not be anything close to normal. After all, he couldn't exactly say that a death god was using it as a temporary shelter. It was simply too ridiculous. Still, if a creak was coming from his closet, it could only have had been caused by a single individual. Without moving his body, he turned his eyes in the direction of his opening closet. Rukia quietly slipped out, a resigned look over her face that immediately caused concern to emerge from within him. When she fully exited the room, it was only then that he pushed himself off from his bed and grabbed Khan, who made a startled noise in which he instantly muffled. Walking towards his window, he saw Rukia quietly making her way down the street. Clicking his tongue, he got dressed and immediately followed after, closing the door to his room as he left, not noticing that Lilynet's pair of eyes had opened, and not hearing the sound of another door in the house opening as Khan demanded to know what was happening. Rukia didn't get far before he eventually caught up. The resigned expression on her face had only increased the further she walked. The moon hung high overhead, not a single other person in sight. It was the utter silence though that unnerved him. It was simply too quiet. Enough so to get the hairs to stand at the back of his neck. Near the end of the street was where Rukia had decided to stop, the one-piece dress she wore fluttering without any indication of wind. Standing alone, she appeared fragile at that moment, a stark contrast to the headstrong woman he was used to. Something was going to happen tonight, and he knew it. He moved closer and decided to wait and see what Rukia was up to. Unknown to him, he wasn't the only one observing the ongoing scene, many pairs of eyes were, and even one pair that inexplicably began to water. After staring at Rukia for what seemed like an eternity, he could no longer take it anymore. This wasn't the Rukia he knew. This wasn't an expression that should ever appear on her face again. His name was Ichigo. The one who protects. He had failed one person before, and never again would he let himself fail another. Not when the scars of the first had yet to heal if ever. Rukia, he called out, startling her. Trembling, Rukia tuned around, her lips pursed together. "I'll leave while you can," she yelled, her expression schooling and morphing into one of anger. His steps slowing, it only took a moment for him to decide on a course of action. There could only be one. To protect. "Ichigo, you dash." Before Rukia could even finish her words, a Senkaimon appeared behind her. From it, 3 figures walked out along with a cold voice. "Rukia Kukaki. By orders of the Central 46, you are hereby under arrest." Chapter 14, The Vasto of White, Part 1. Why do you wait if you know you wish to act? You need only raise this spear and none will block your path. Gibalg's words echoed within his mind as he sat with an elbow propped to his knee. "Humph, the words of a brute lacking etiquette." Kyuka's voice then rebutted. She appeared to be more talkative today as she was near Aizen Sosuke. Truth be told, for this particular matter, he was more inclined to do what Gibalg had suggested. However, Aizen did raise some fairly good points earlier on. If he went himself to the human world at the moment, there was no doubt that his presence would indeed be like stirring up a hornet's nest. In which case, countless numbers of Shinigami may appear to combat him, but more likely would be the deployment of Captain-class Shinigami with each possessing their own Bankai, as Aizen had put it. A Shinigami's main weapon was a Zanpakuto. In its released state was a Shikai, allowing a Shinigami to exhibit the unique properties of their sword, but not to its fullest extent. For such a thing to be possible, a Shinigami would have to release their Bankai, the second release of their blade. In this state, not only would a Shinigami's spiritual energy skyrocket, but their Zanpakuto's abilities would further increase with a wider arsenal depending on the Shinigami. This was all explained by Aizen previously, and he had greatly stressed the degree of strength a Shinigami would obtain in their Bankai. For this matter, he had reasoned that should any captain-level Shinigami run into Silent in the human world, there was no way she would be able to escape. Thus, Aizen had only sent a weaker hollow, Eriniro, to locate Silent and Lilynet and bring them back. With this approach, the chances of attracting Captain-class Shinigami into the human world should have been drastically decreased. Still, Eriniro had been sent a while ago, and with no word of what was happening in the human world, he was already near the end of his patience. He got up from his sitting position and moved towards where Aizen was working on his device while being watched by a staggering group of Ajich's-class hollows. As he approached, he saw a couple of new faces in the crowd. Haribel and her group had returned from the training they were doing near the outer reaches of the vast land he presumably controlled. Presently, they were staring curiously at Aizen's presence with Apasai and Mila Rose already glaring. It was reasonable though. It was the exact same reason why Aizen was surrounded by numerous hollows. Not one of them trusted the actions of Shinigami, and Aizen was no exception. Perhaps if he had aided them in some way it would be different, but right now Aizen was simply intruding in their territory through their eyes. To him, however, Aizen was putting in an effort to help him, deepening his impression of the man. Of course, Kyoka's voice echoed with a hint of praise. You can expect nothing less from my master. He gave a wry smile, seeing the difference in Kyoka's demeanor as she continued giving out incessant praise. Right now, though, that wasn't important. As if noticing his gaze, Haribel met his eyes and soon made her way over, her actions drawing the eyes of everyone present to him. After all, when a Vasto Lord moved, all Hollows had to show respect for their strength. Even more so based on the reputation garnered from the various feats they had accomplished. Take Stark for example. Although many belittled him for his lazy behavior in passing, not a single Hollow failed to show respect to him after recalling his strength. Haribel too was similar, yet she was far more appreciated by the other Hollows than Stark. Unlike Stark, who remained idle for the majority of the day, Haribel was different as she strove to further improve herself and those around her. This was evident to Hollows even before Haribel had arrived, as she was protecting her own group then. As such, she had taken to training with the other Hollows, teaching them the extent of their capabilities so they could better draw a bottom line when fighting others. The ability to know when to attack and retreat was vital after all. In the views of the other Hollows, Haribel was like a quasi-master who would provide pointers from time to time. This disparity between the two was evident again as only she was present at the moment, and Stark wasn't. However, what the other Hollows didn't know was that Stark was actually in the process of helping Brands recover and not just lying on his ass somewhere. Still, that was irrelevant at the moment. What is going on here? Haribel asked curiously, her gaze remaining calm as she waited for an answer. He could tell from her expression that she didn't particularly mind being in the presence of a Shinigami, but she didn't particularly like it either. In this regard, she was far better than the three that followed her, which continued to glare. Because of this, he took his attention away from Aizen to explain the situation to Haribel, inadvertently informing the newer Hollows that had arrived as well. The brat was sent of all things. Mila Rose spoke incredulously. I could probably beat her with just a finger. Apasai crossed her arms. In that case I'd defeat her with only a flick, she spoke. Sung Sun remained quiet on the matter and instead turned her attention on Aizen, her expression showing her lack of trust. And you would heed the words of a Shinigami? She questioned. He has not shown any hostilities, so I will not be the one to start them, he replied evenly. Unlike other Hollows, he did not hold prejudice towards Shinigami, nor belittlement towards humans. Besides, he's in the process of helping, was what he wanted to say, but it was contradictory as he was probably about to do something foolish that would render Aizen's efforts null. Feeling a tad awkward, he coughed into his hands and moved the conversation away from that topic. Instead, he nodded towards Haribel and the rest before standing in front of Aizen. How much longer is this going to take? He asked, unable to hide his impatience. Aizen furrowed his brows. Such things cannot be rushed to ensure ideal results, Aizen reasoned before pointing at a piece of the device, a gauge. The required preparation is only around half, and forcing any more spiritual energy in would only cause further damage. At the least, it's still going to take a bit more time. He couldn't help frowning. Already he felt a great sense of urgency as he couldn't help but question his earlier action of putting off his own arrival. Initially, he had been able to be practical about his decision, and this was through the accumulation of maturity over the years in Aizen's deductions. However, as more and more time began to pass, he just felt a sense of wrongness welling from within him as if this was not what he should have done. This wasn't the sort of person he was. It was this line of thought that allowed him to feel as if he had come to understand something he had lost in his life in Hueco Mundo. Then I will be going now regardless, he said, drawing an alarmed expression from Aizen's face. Very quickly, Aizen placed his work down and turned to face him. Doing so now will definitely not be in your best interest, Aizen said calmly. In fact, I've just received word from the Soul Society of Dash. I appreciate your concerns, Aizen, he spoke evenly, cutting off whatever it was Aizen was about to say. He then outstretched one of his arms and forcibly tore a hole between dimensions at that moment. I really do, but there are times when one must act without regard to consequences. If one always thought first before acting, then why act at all if the opportunity had already been missed? It was the same concept of fighting first and asking questions later, in the same way a father would naturally defend their child without knowing that their child may have had done wrong. Aizen fell quiet, his face going blank. And besides, regardless of what others think, even now, I don't believe I'm a person who considers every aspect before coming to a decision. Rather, like the girl you saw unknowingly sent to the human world. He stepped forward towards his self-made Gargantia under the gaze of everyone present, a distant memory surfacing from the depths of his mind. Turning his head to Eisen, he opened his mouth to speak. "I was always an idiot," was all that he said before disappearing. The expression left on Eisen's face was one that was hard to describe, but if one could place a word on it, it would be perturbed. There is a reason why so many of us follow him. Haribel took the lead and moved towards the opened Gargantia while speaking to Eisen. "Perhaps you yourself will one day understand why." With that said, Haribel too disappeared through the Gargantia accompanied by her followers. Even Nell, who first considered her options, subconsciously moved forward. Following her, came many other of the stronger hollows of Ajitja's class. The once hollow-filled area was now reduced to a few that remained along with Eisen and Ulquiorra, who had been within the crowd. Turning towards Eisen, Ulquiorra conveyed his intentions before he too stepped forth within the Gargantia, leaving Eisen alone. Pressing a hand to his forehead, Eisen let out a small laugh before his eyes flashed with something indiscernible. In a quick motion, he then disappeared, returning to the Soul Society. Ichigo did not understand the current situation, let alone why Rukia's face had paled considerably to the point that even her body was trembling. As far as he was concerned though, he didn't need to. It was just that seeing the look in her eyes as she saw the approaching people was more than enough. His face was set in a glare as almost immediately it became apparent that it was a wise decision to leave his home after ejecting his spirit from his body. Garbed in the attire of a Shinigami, his hands tightened around the hilt of his sword as the feel of the people approaching him was far more than any hollow he had ever faced. They were 3 in total. One of them had red hair tied into a ponytail that resembled a pineapple. From his forehead, he could see long lines of tribal tattoos that even spread down towards his body. Looking at him, he quickly realized that their gazes locked upon arrival, causing the man to instantly glare with a murderous intent. "Renji," Rukia said before staring conflictedly at the next person. "Brother, Byakuya." The man was tall and draped in a white hirei that was placed over top his black Shinigami garb with a long scarf around his neck. His features were as soft and refined as Rukia's, yet his contained a sense of masculinity that was undoubtedly irresistible to most women. His face was slightly rectangular with a narrow chin and high cheekbones that accentuated his sharp dark eyes, which were set firmly on Rukia. His black hair shifted as he moved, the majority of it held up by 3 white-colored hair ornaments shaped like combs. Byakuya did not respond to Rukia calling out to him. Instead, his eyes flashed towards the third companion, who was busy muttering to himself. The third companion was an odd man who seemed slightly off no matter how one looked at him. He wore the same white hirei over his shoulders, but he kept an ornament around his head that resembled a white boat from the side. Other than that, his entire face was painted black aside from his nose and lower cheeks. Of the 3, this man seemed wholly indifferent to the situation, making him seem less harmless than Renji, whose glare was screaming murder. However, from the expression of fear on Rukia's face, this man was not to be trifled with. Nervously, his hands clenched tightly around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles going white as an ominous feeling swelled from within him. He swallowed as Renji seemed to have had enough of waiting, instantly seeming to come to his conclusions. "So that's it," Renji spoke heatedly as he approached, drawing his blade. "You're the human who got his power from Rukia." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, looking at the sword he held in his own hands and the events that had happened that night. Renji was immediately angered and drew his sword and attacked him, making Rukia's eyes widen. He didn't have time to notice any of that though. Instead, Renji was already pressuring him to defend. His sword was barely able to move, if at all, due to the speed of Renji's slashes. In fact, if it wasn't so abnormally large that it could barely pass off for a shield, then he was sure that he would have gotten injured by now. "Come on. Is this all the power you have? Is that sword just for show?" Renji yelled while swinging each time. He clicked his tongue and roared out in response. Strength moved to his arms, and when next Renji attacked, he lashed out with the force of his blade, yet Renji was no longer there. What was going on? His eyes darted back and forth. Fighting an enemy was one thing, losing sight of them was another. It was then that he noticed it. A shadow. His pupils constricted before he immediately attempted to turn his body. Yet, it was not enough. He could hear a gasp come out from Rukia's mouth, but almost at the same time, a searing pain blossomed across the back of his shoulder, forcing him to his knees. Stabbing his sword down into the ground, he ended up using it as a crutch. His breathing was a tad labored, but if anything, Renji did not pierce through his chest, but rather only cut into his skin. A hand went up to his shoulder, instantly dyeing itself red in blood. Ichigo! Rukia called while running forward. Yet someone grabbed her arm. I don't suggest moving, Ishida spoke as he pushed up his glasses. Renji glanced up at Ishida. Who are you? Just a classmate, Ishida spoke before letting go of Rukia's hand. To think that I would stumble upon you Shinigami while suddenly getting the urge to visit the sunflower knitting shop this late in the evening. It wasn't as if I could sense the fluctuations in spiritual pressure and used my knitting hobby as an excuse to chance into Y-. The bag of appliances Ishida held in his other hand was cut in half. I asked you a question, Renji spoke. Ishida ignored Renji and instead shifted his sight towards Ichigo. You like you're on your last breaths Kurosaki, Ishida spoke. He grunted before forcing himself onto his feet. And you're just late, he responded as Renji refocused on him. Do you really think you would actually be able to compare to a real Shinigami? Renji asked mockingly. It was evident from the last exchange. Do not be so quick to judge, Renji, a calm voice echoed out. See Captain. Renji stuttered. He and Ishida turned their attention towards Byakuya who had opened his mouth to speak. The secret remote squad has reports of this boy severely injuring Aminos Grande, Byakuya explained. Him. Renji laughed before his features sharpened into a glare. What a joke. The secret remote squad must really be slipping these days. What a load of shit. Look at this kid, how could he possibly drive back Aminos Grande? Even more so with an overgrown Zanpakuto like that. Byakuya kept silent after Renji's outburst, but the other Shinigami did not. The third Shinigami hummed, causing a chill to go down Renji's back. Although I could care less about what you do with the boy, do remember whose presence you're standing in when you slander the technology of the research department. My apologies Captain Kurotsuke, Renji stammered. Who is he? Ishida ended up whispering to Rukia's ear, curious about the reaction Renji had towards his fellow Soul Reaper. Mayuri Kurotsuke, captain of Squad 12, but better known as the overseer of the Research and Development Division of the Soul Society, Rukia answered. He has quite a reputation involving him and his experiments that most Shinigami fear staying in close contact with him. As if I care for your apologies, Mayuri said while keeping his attention on a chart he brought with him. Just hurry up and finish what you came here to do. There are other matters for me to take care of. Understood, Renji said hurriedly before brandishing his sword. Roar, Zabumaru. Renji brushed a hand across his sword, and the plain katana transformed into a black segmented spiked blade. What happened to his sword? He called out in surprise. You don't even know the name of your own blade? As expected from someone like you who can't even control his own spiritual energy, Renji said as he leaned his sword against his shoulder. Regardless, it's time for you to die so that Rukia can get her power back, and then be sentenced to death within the Soul Society. What he didn't know, and what Rukia refused to tell him, was that she broke a law by giving him her powers. In the Soul Society, everything is held through tradition with iron set rules that cannot be broken through severe punishments. It just so happened that a Soul Reaper giving their power to a human was of the highest treason punishable by death. He narrowed his eyes as Renji's words entered his ears. It was all the more reason why he could not allow Rukia to be taken away. Ishida pulled up to his side, signaling with his eyes his intentions. He nodded back in gratitude. Having waited long enough, Renji leapt into the air and attacked. Howl, Zabumaru. Renji swung his blade down, the segmented pieces splitting and extending its reach. In fact, it was even able to bend around his blade. Kurosaki. Ishida reacted fast enough to shove Ichigo out of the way from taking another blow to his opposite shoulder. Renji grunted as his eyes moved to Ishida. Not bad, but a human who can just see us will be useless in this battle. A blue glow encompassed the area, drawing the gazes of everyone present. Even Mayuri took his eyes away from the items he had on hand. "A Quincy," Mayuri muttered before becoming indifferent. "It's unfortunate that I've concluded my research with them." Hearing Mayuri's comment, Ishida's expression instantly grew cold, yet he did not have time to question. His hands drew the motions of drawing, an arrow of Reishi forming along his bow as he observed Renji's movements. This is time to prove the strength of Quincy. Not through competition, but through battle. Ichigo had taught him that not all Shinigami were the same, but the ones in front of him now were truly acting in the fashion he hated. Especially the indifference on Byakuya's face resembling the ones of the Shinigami that failed to aid his grandfather. Even more so when he heard Rukia call out to him to put a stop to Renji's actions, yet he did nothing. "A Quincy, a failed Soul Reaper, it doesn't matter," Renji spoke swinging his blade in an arc. "Under the attack of true Soul Reapers, you're nothing." A cold sweat began to appear over Ichigo's face as he realized all too soon that Renji did not withdraw his blade after the first swing, but rather the second came instantly cutting across his body. He coughed out blood, a feeling of powerlessness taking over him as his sword dropped to the ground. "Then let me take over." His heartbeat sped up, pain no longer coming from his wounds, but in his state, he still remained motionless. "That's enough, Renji!" Rukia yelled, jumping onto Renji and preventing him from swinging his sword again. Ishida attempted to help, but almost instantly a feeling of foreboding took over him as he realized the danger of taking his eyes off Byakuya, who had begun to move forward. In the middle of everything, Ichigo once again gripped the handle of his sword, this time causing Byakuya to pause in his steps. "His spiritual pressure is rising," Byakuya observed. He was not the only one to notice the startling increase in spiritual energy Ichigo was emitting. Both Renji and Rukia had too, both freezing in their actions. "What the hell?" Renji swore, pushing Rukia off of him. "How is this possible? Is that really Kurosaki?" Ishida couldn't help but shudder and recall the experience with Ichigo's energy against the Minos Grande. Ichigo felt power coursing through his veins. Nothing seemed to matter anymore to him. His injuries were nothing, the current situation was nothing, all that was left was a single goal to protect. He didn't know what happened to him, nor did he dwell too much on the matter. Instead he attacked in a burst of speed that left Renji unable to react. Blood splattered across the ground, the forehead protector Renji wore shattering into pieces, letting blood drip across his face. "Damn it!" Renji swore as he attacked continuously with his blade once more. Yet he dodged Renji's blade as if it were nothing more than a child swinging a stick. By the third swing, Zabumaru returned to its blade form, and he instantly lunged in to attack. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You've gotten a lot slower." It wasn't that Renji had gotten slower, but due to the increasing spiritual energy, he was unknowingly getting faster. A twitch formed over Renji's brow, but he could do nothing as attacks continuously landed on him. If not for the pressure Byakuya was placing on Ishida, then Renji was sure that his situation would have had become hopeless by now. Ichigo knew that this was going to be his only opportunity. With his power increasing as it was, and his senses heightened, there was no way he was going to lose to Renji. Inevitably, he soon cornered Renji and placed him in a situation where he was unable to evade his next swing. One down. This thought echoed across his mind as he swung, yet near the end of his swing, he suddenly realized that his sword had gotten a lot lighter. He blinked, looking at his severed sword. What happened?" "Ichigo!" Ishida yelled, bleeding from the ground. "Don't underestimate him," he forced out before falling silent. Beside Ishida stood Byakuya, who didn't seem as if he had even drawn his sword. Yet in Byakuya's hand was. How's that even possible? Byakuya should have had been too far away to act, yet he had somehow defeated Ishida as if he was nothing while still having the time to sever his blade by the shaft. Byakuya placed a hand on his blade. He immediately readied his own, even if all that remained was the hilt in a small portion, and in that moment Byakuya just disappeared. His senses screamed danger, but he was too slow to even react as blood then splattered across his face. He froze at that moment. Ignoring the gaping wound on his chest in favor of staring at the woman who had blocked Byakuya's second blow. Lilynette was grumbling to herself as she watched the proceedings from a distance. Having never been sleeping for too long in the first place, she had obviously noticed Ichigo's departure and had followed. From her current vantage point, she could make out a few others who were similarly watching, one of which was the black-haired girl she had previously seen in Ichigo's house. Karen, if she could recall the name Ichigo had called her. The girl was trembling, her features pale as she watched Ichigo fight that other red-haired Shinigami. Luckily though, Karen knew better than to run into the middle of such a fight. As she was a resident of Hueco Mundo, she knew full well that it was better to not interfere between conflicts, or at least that was what Starkey had told her in passing. Either way, she felt a tad conflicted at the moment as she didn't dislike Ichigo. In fact, Ichigo had even showed her around town in her search for Silent, and had allowed her to experience this human treat called ice cream. As a hollow, she didn't really need to eat, but that didn't mean she couldn't. As for the others, she couldn't care less. They weren't her friends, nor were they any hollows she had ever seen within Shiro's territory. Thus, she didn't feel a need to help. And besides, something about the Shinigami in makeup creeped her out, and the other calm and collected one just screamed danger. Normally she wouldn't care of such things, but Starkey wasn't here. To her, Starkey was the strongest, and so long as he was nearby, she feared no one. However, now that he wasn't here, she had actually grown a tad timid as she realized that they were truly separated for the first time. Anyways, what did the current situation have to do with her? All she wanted to do was find Silent so that they could return to Hueco Mundo. Embarrassingly, another reason she needed to find her was that she didn't know how to create a Gargantia back to Hueco Mundo herself. It was something only Starkey would have had known between the two. Turning back to Ichigo's battle, she couldn't help but be surprised by the increasing spiritual energy. It really wasn't normal. If before she could have had dealt with him with a couple zeros, now she wasn't quite sure. She knew she was somewhat weak when compared to the other Aegis-class hollows in Shiro's territory, but she still had some strength. She nodded her head. She was definitely still stronger. Yet, her sense of foreboding still warned her against facing the level-headed Shinigami and the one with makeup. Yet that decision was taken out of her hands. The level-headed Shinigami had moved, severing Ichigo's blade and coming in for his own attack. That wasn't what caused her to act though. It was Silent who stood blocking the second attack with her arm bleeding and a segment of her clothes cut open to reveal her hollow hole. The level-headed Shinigami pulled back and assessed the situation with a hint of surprise. For a moment, no one moved. Not the girl from Ichigo's house. Not any of the Soul Reapers. And not even herself. All that was able to be observed were the shifting of expressions found on everyone's faces and the minute movements of their bodies. The black-haired girl, for example, had a look of terror flicker across her face as her body set forward into motion. Still though, it would take her a while before arriving at the battlefield as she had been watching from a distance away. Aside from everyone else's blank expressions, perhaps the only two with different reactions were the Shinigami with makeup, and Ichigo himself. The Shinigami with makeup's demeanor instantly changed upon spotting Silent's hollow hole, and something seemed to come alive within his eyes. He moved to draw his blade. Meanwhile Ichigo just seemed lost, unable to understand that he had been wounded and should be pressing a hand to staunch the bleeding. Idiot. With a single thought, she moved and displayed her brash personality despite her apprehension. You don't know who you're dealing with. She called, landing beside Silent who grimaced from her injuries. Luckily, Silent was tough for a hollow, her skin unable to be pierced so easily. Yet despite that, the level-headed Shinigami had still drawn blood, proving her earlier sentiments about this Shinigami. She turned her head to stare at Ichigo. You look like a mess, she spoke before asking. Who are these guys? Ichigo didn't answer, causing her to frown, but he didn't have to as someone else did it for him. My name is Mayuri Kuratsuki, the Shinigami with makeup introduced. And those two are Byakuya Kukiki, and Renji Abarai. You are. She shivered. She didn't like the way Mayuri was looking at her and Silent, and thus didn't give a response other than to charge a zero. Admittedly, it was the only attack she had that could do any damage. Almost as soon as she charged up her zero, Mayuri's eyes lit up even further. It was then that Silent charged up her own zero. At this point, anyone was able to see the grin that appeared over Mayuri's face. Interesting, too interesting, Mayuri acted nonchalant despite having 2 attacks aimed at him. What are you? I can't wait to find out, he spoke before the blade in his hand transformed into a trident-like golden-colored sword. You bastard! Ichigo suddenly became enraged as he realized who Mayuri was pointing his sword at. She was too on Silent's behalf, but not to Ichigo's extent. In fact, the look in his eyes frightened her to a certain degree as his spiritual pressure once again began to skyrocket. Even with the broken sword he had on hand, his surge in energy put everyone on high alert. What the hell's wrong with this guy? Renji cursed, staring at Ichigo's sudden rise in power again. His strength is even on par with the lieutenant's and he hasn't even released his Shikai. Stand down, Renji, Byakuya spoke, moving forward once again. Renji nodded, and pulled back to stand behind Byakuya as they both turned their attention to Lilynet and Silent, who were standing off against Mayuri. What Lilynet didn't understand though was why Silent had even acted on Ichigo's behalf. In fact, looking at her face, she appeared to be in a daze of sorts. Both her and Ichigo were. Oi, snap out of it! She called, kicking Ichigo in the shin and yelling directly into Silent's ear. As if coming back to his senses, Ichigo yelped in pain from the sudden blow and glowered at Lilynet before remembering the person in front of him. He then turned to Silent and muttered. This can't be real, can it? Ichigo's hands were trembling based on how hard he gripped his sword. Mom! He called out hoarsely. From the sound of his voice, it was easy for her to hear the fragility and longing laced within. Silent shuddered after hearing Ichigo speak, yet she didn't turn around as she was wholly focused on Mayuri. Suddenly, the zero in her hand faltered for a moment, as blood trickled down her arm. Blood that dripped slowly from Byakuya's blade. Ichigo's eyes turned murderous. He didn't care if he had a sword at the moment, let alone half of one. He swore that he would not be letting Byakuya's attack go unanswered. And yet, he staggered on his feet, realizing the extent of his own injuries. It was hard for him to breathe, a stab wound just above his left lung and near his stomach. He collapsed on his knees, his sword barely able to be used as a support. Lilynet didn't know what to feel as she stared at Ichigo's state, yet she did decide on one thing. He wasn't bad. In fact, at times she found the energy he emitted was similar to a hollow's, and even still, it was rich and powerful. Stark, she whispered nervously, clenching her hands as a feeling of sudden dread filled her being. Mayuri had begun to move. Where are you? A short distance away, Byakuya motioned to Renji, telling him to secure Rukia as his attention moved to a cat roaming quietly atop a high fence wall. He then shook his head, as horrid memories began to assail his mind regarding a certain master of flash step. There was definitely more at play here, and he knew better than to let his guard down. Wordlessly, Renji moved to Rukia's side. You will follow, he ordered, yet he couldn't hide the reluctance in his voice. Evidently, Rukia had noticed, as her gaze drooped down solemnly. At least Ichigo was currently safe, but she knew that if she stayed, it would only be doing more harm than good. Renji, I dash. Don't go, Ishida spoke as he grabbed Rukia's leg. Still though, it appeared that this action alone was all that he was capable of as his eyes then shut closed. Renji clicked his tongue, and then promptly grabbed Rukia's arm. Before he could move however, a deafening explosion sounded from behind him. Both Silent and Lilynet had fired off their zeros. Mayuri coughed from the subsequent smoke that encompassed him, but the man was fine aside from a few minor injuries and a missing arm. Oh dear, Mayuri spoke with a grimace before extracting a syringe and needle from his clothing. He then injected it to his missing arm. But I suppose it doesn't matter for now, he finished as a new arm rapidly formed. See? Good as new. Mayuri Kuratsuke, the head of the Research and Development Department of the Soul Society. It was said that nothing was impossible for the man should he so desire it. He need only achieve it through his own research, ethical or not. This was the mindset of a scientist. All in the pursuit of further discovery. It was not odd for him to carry such concoctions as the one he had used to grow a new arm. In fact, no one in the Soul Society knew just what kind of materials Mayuri kept on his person. What a freak, Lilynet sneered. Sure, she had seen similar actions from hollows and their regeneration, but to see it on a Shinigami's red flesh, it was a first. It was then that Silent tapped gently on Lilynet's shoulder. Instantly, Lilynette knew her intentions. She turned towards Ichigo before picking him up and retreating. Unable to react to the sudden turn of events, Ichigo could only watch helplessly as Silent was left to deal with Mayuri on her own. Ichigo. Karen then appeared in view, adding on to the situation, but she supposed this was a good thing. Lilynette threw Ichigo towards Karen as almost immediately she felt some sort of appendage wrap around her ankle. "You don't believe I would let something as interesting as you go now, do you?" Mayuri spoke as the earpiece of his head ornament opened to reveal a comma and chain. Said chain was now wrapped around Lilynette's ankle with parts of it strong enough to even dig into Lilynette's skin and draw blood. A blue light once again enveloped the area, a similar scene from the last occurring again. Silent stood with a fiery blue bow of spiritual energy in hand, much like Ishida's. However, hers was far more potent and exuded a certain strength. Clearly, she was far stronger than Ishida, who had been taken down by Byakuya in an instant. A hollow with no mask able to use the powers of a Quincy. The expression on Mayuri's face could only be described as euphoric, as if he had found a long-lost treasure. Forget the one with the partially broken mask, this one was far more interesting. Still, it would indeed be a mishap on his part if he allowed the one with the partially broken mask to go. He could already picture how outstanding the research material would be. As such, he was done playing. The chain and comma he had used were barbed and coated with the same poison as the one found on his blade. This poison would paralyze the body at the specific location and prevent function for Hollows and Soul Reaper alike. Long enough exposure would also mean death. The effects were evident as Lilynette was no longer able to move her leg. With a tug, he had forced her back onto the ground to stand by Silent's side. Silent had not been able to shoot in fear of hitting Lilynette. She knew her shots were powerful, but she knew her aim was not the best, and as such would prefer it if she was up close and personal. She positioned herself in front of Lilynette as Mayuri's comma and chain returned back to him. With a thought, there was an arrow. With a breath, there was an action. A Quincy's strength lied in their ability to draw the natural spiritual energy within the environment and even within themselves. Concentration was crucial for such an endeavor. The arrow Silent had on her bow began to grow larger and larger to the point that Byakuya had no choice but to put on a stern expression. Byakuya was a Soul Reaper, a Shinigami. It was his duty to prevent disaster to befall the human world through the acts of the supernatural. Just from the size alone of Silent's attack, he resolved himself to action. Beads of sweat were beginning to form over Silent's forehead, her hair being blown back from the force of the arrow she was generating. Even the skin of her hands was beginning to flake and peel, yet still she persisted. The reason it was taking her so long to fire was that she was locating a remote region of Karakura town where she was sure she would not injure any human. Yet before she could even fire, a cold feeling burst from within her chest. She swallowed before looking down at the blade protruding from her stomach. Under the pressure of Mayuri, she had been unable to react in time to the sudden attack. Byakuya Kukaki of the Kukaki clan. Not only was he strong, but his speed, his shunpo, or flash step was unmatched within the current Soul Society aside from one or two individuals. Even when he had first attacked Ichigo, Silent was only able to perceive the second blow as the first had been too fast for her to even react. Power is nothing if one cannot unleash it, Byakuya said coolly before a pink glow suddenly enveloped him. Take that, ya bastard! Lilynette growled from her position propped up against the ground. With one of her legs paralyzed, her mobility had been greatly reduced to the point of just crawling. Currently, she had just blasted Byakuya with a zero. Blinking, Byakuya had a disheveled appearance, but he did not appear critically injured. Lilynette's strength was low even in regards to an Ajicha's class Hollow, what more against a Captain class Shinigami. In fact, perhaps her strength was only useful when combating seated officers or lower in Shinigami rankings. Byakuya only shook his head before promptly knocking out both Silent and Lilynette with his speed. If anything, the only thing that troubled him at the moment was the intense stare of the black cat in the distance. Yet he would never admit such a thing. I did not need the help, Mayuri spoke as he approached Byakuya. Nor did you care about what happens to the area around you and the people in it, Byakuya replied. Mayuri didn't respond and was instead in the process of examining Silent as he held her up by the hair. In the very same process, unexpectedly, a rock hit his head. An unnoticeable twitch formed over his brow. "Fuck off, you bully." Karen had run forward while leaving Ichigo clambering uselessly behind her, fury in her reddened eyes. "Let her go. What is with this town?" Renji grumbled. "How many humans have enough spiritual energy to see us?" Finishing his words, Renji then moved in Karen's direction, yet Rukia immediately stopped him. How could she not? Karen was Ichigo's sister and she herself was well acquainted with the brash girl. "Karen, don't!" Ichigo warned as he forced himself back onto his feet, his eyes going bloodshot. "Get behind me," he urged. "I'll save her," he grit his teeth saying. No matter what Ichigo said though, it appeared highly unlikely that he would be able to accomplish such a task. His level of strength was near Ishida's level, and Ishida had been taken out in an instant by Byakuya. Ignoring Ichigo's words, Karen picked up another stone to throw, unknowingly coating it in a thin blue light. "I said let her go," she screamed, throwing the stone. Steam hissed, as the smell of burnt flesh permeated through the air. The speed in which the stone Karen threw was fast enough to continue spinning in Mayuri's outstretched hand. "Do you know what happens to unwanted pests?" Mayuri's voice was undoubtedly annoyed. "I string them up with my fingers before prepping them on a lab table where I take my time to procure anything useful from their bodies. Now unless you have something useful worth my time, I sug dash." Another stone bounced off Mayuri's head. The sound of it rolling across the cement of the street evident for all to hear. There was a short silence as both Renji, Rukia, and Byakuya were astounded by Karen's actions in provoking Mayuri Kuratsuki. Placing silent on the ground, Mayuri released a heavy spiritual pressure down on the area. Ichigo, already injured as he was, collapsed flat on his body. Karen, who had never been put through such a thing, was in a similar situation to the point that she could even feel her organs getting crushed. "My patience has never been long, girl." Mayuri moved forward towards Karen, his intentions clear. Yet at that moment, a hand clasped firmly around Mayuri's ankles. Silent glared defiantly from the ground, her wounds still bleeding profusely. Irritated as he was already, Mayuri stomped down on Silent. Thump. Thump. Thwack. It was the sound one would hear when pounding on a piece of meat. Silent's face and body had long ago become beaten, bruised, and bloody, but still she did not let go of Mayuri. Staring off at Ichigo and Karen with a fierce light in her eyes. She knew them. They meant something to her. They were dear. And she would not let them be harmed in any way. She did not know this feeling that overcame her, driving her to endure, yet it was an instinct of sorts that only women could intuitively describe. A mother's love. Seeing the scene in front of her, Karen was in tears and was cursing her inability to even withstand the mysterious force over her. As the wretched sound continued to filter into her ears, she couldn't help but despair at that moment. "Ichigo, please, do something," she pleaded before passing out. "Aah!" Ichigo screamed, pushing himself up despite the spiritual pressure pressing down on him. "I'll kill you." And yet, other than standing, he couldn't even move. Eventually being forced back onto the ground exhausted and out cold. "Ichigo," Rukia muttered before clenching her fists. She did not know who this woman was to Ichigo, nor did she hear any of the interaction he had had with Lilynet, but she knew what she had to do. She noticed Renji's grip on her arm grow slack, and in that moment, she pulled free and immediately took Mayuri by surprise. As Mayuri was solely directing his spiritual pressure upon Ichigo and Karen, she was unimpeded as she kicked him across the face and sent him flying. One could imagine how enraged Mayuri had become, immediately attacking with lethal force. "Rukia!" Renji called in concern. Byakuya however noticed a shadow move in the distance, his eyes narrowing. The air suddenly became moist as a film of moving water blocked Mayuri's attack and obscured the sight of Rukia, Lilynet, and Silent. "We meet again, Kukaki," a familiar voice echoed out in the night as a figure spoke from within the waters. Every pair of eyes widened in disbelief, but none more so than Rukia. Under the protection of a flowing dome of spirit-made water, a man stood protectively in front of Rukia, holding both Masaki and Lilynet under his arms. "I just wish the situation could have had been better," the man spoke within the silence. Araniro was internally cursing his current situation. If not for Aizen ordering him through a message to protect Lilynet in silent, he would have damn well never have had acted and let the fools earn what they had sowed. However, not only did Aizen order him to protect, he had also informed him of the Vasto of White's impending arrival. In Hueco Mundo, none other than the more reclusive Hollows did not know of the strength the Vasto of White possessed. Stronger than even the God King Barragan of Las Noches. And his power was truly absolute. He did not know the Vasto of White's temperament, but he did not wish to test it either. If the Vasto of White himself would personally move to ensure the lives of the two he was currently protecting, then he wouldn't want to be caught in a situation where it appeared that he had done nothing to defend the two. At least this way he did not risk obtaining the Vasto Lord's ire, and at the same time he could perhaps gain favor instead. Besides, he had an ability different from most Hollows that made him confident that he wouldn't be killed right away even if he was captured. And by then, Lord Aizen would have probably found a way to rescue him. After all, it was because of Lord Aizen that he got to where he was now. Therefore, why then would Aizen waste his own investment? Thus, it was highly unlikely that Aizen would abandon him. His ability was one based on his ability to continue evolving by absorbing the strengths and powers of others, both Shinigami and Hollow alike. Not only did he absorb their strength, he also assimilated their memories and personalities. In which case, this allowed him to handle the current situation by altering his appearance. Lieutenant Kaienshiba, presumably dead in battle, Byakuya spoke with a hint of surprise lacing his voice. What is the meaning of this? Yes indeed. Kaienshiba was the form he was currently taking. Aside from some minor discomfort in taking the form, it wasn't impossible to maintain. Rukia, I want you to take these two and get out of here, he spoke. Kaien? Rukia asked, still in a daze. He clicked his tongue. How useless. You're protecting the Hollow? Byakuya questioned. He remained silent as he pondered the situation. He knew that he stood no chance against either Byakuya or Mayuri in a confrontation. Then what was he to do? Rukia was currently useless as now that he thought about it, even if she took Lilynet in silent, she would not abandon the orange-haired kid. This situation was just too difficult, he inwardly complained. This is, Renji muttered. You must be an imposter. Renji's outburst caused a flicker of doubt to enter Rukia's and the other Shinigami's eyes. Still, he paid it no mind as he was sure that any suspicion would be shed when he revealed his Zanpakuto. I'll be taking this. It would be a pity if I did not research it. The voice was directly next to his ear, causing him to immediately react. He slashed out with his sword, but it was too late. Mayuri was once again on the other side holding silent in one arm. Luckily, because of his quick reaction, he had prevented Mayuri from taking Lilynet. If you take her, you will regret it, he spoke with a grimace. Hardly, Mayuri spoke before eyeing Lilynet. Then you've forced my hand, he spoke before brandishing his blade in front of him. Rage through the seas and the heavens, Nijibana. As soon as his Zanpakuto displayed itself, not one Shinigami present doubted his identity, and this was exactly what he wanted. It really is you, Rukia stuttered. Mayuri raised a brow. And why would a Shinigami like you care for a Hollow? You don't know what it's like in Hueco Mundo, was his response, eliciting a gasp from Rukia as she should know how Kaienshiba ended up there. Mayuri shrugged. Well, don't care, he said. Besides, I believe you know what it means to be cut by my sword. One of his arms slackened before falling to his side. Indeed, it was a paralysis-like effect that he knew from Kaien's memories. The order of events may have seemed long, but they all happened in mere moments from the point that he had been protecting the two, till the point Mayuri had swiped silent away from his hands. This result left him at a loss, and as such, he sent a mental message to Aizen using another of his abilities. He truly was conflicted at the moment though, unwilling to place himself in danger for another. But in the end, he chose to follow through with his actions. He opened a Gargantia under the astonished eyes of the Shinigami around him. It was the only way. With how Mayuri continued to eye Lilynet, he knew that Mayuri would quickly make his move, and by then he would be unable to do a thing. Thus, he acted first. Even more so when he realized Byakuya too was going to act. Without much thought, he then tossed Lilynet along with Ulquior's into the Gargantia as almost immediately Byakuya apprehended him with a blade directly to his neck. At least with this, he could vouch for his efforts. Now all that remained was staying alive long enough to be rescued. And for that, he would play all his cards. Kyan Shiba of the Shiba noble clan requests to be judged under the rule of the Central 46, he spoke in protocol. I don't give a damn about your request. Mayuri spoke incensed as he brandished his word. You let a subject get away. Yet before Mayuri could act, Byakuya was already standing on guard, his sword raised protectively by duty. Mayuri, Byakuya spoke. Have you forgotten our purpose here? Your purpose, Mayuri insisted. I only came to research the strange fluctuations in spiritual energy. Presumably I'd found it along with another promising specimen. And this fool has cost me one of them. Seeing his words have no effect on Byakuya, Mayuri grimaced before he opened a Senkaimon and proceeded towards it with silent held under his arm. There was nothing else left for him here. Mayuri was gone with silent in a mere moment. Byakuya sheathed his blade before speaking. Rukia, Byakuya spoke. It is time for us to go, he said. Hesitating, Rukia looked on with a pained expression at Ichigo who lay unmoving on the ground. How could she possibly leave him in this state? Yet she knew that it was better than him being dead. It was a mercy shown by her brother to even allow him to live from this point, so she couldn't complain. Karen though. As she next opened her mouth to bring up the matter, something inexplicable occurred. Another Gargantia formed with an immense spiritual energy pouring out from within. The expression that appeared on Byakuya's face was one Rukia was familiar with. It was the one that spoke of extreme danger. Renji, take Rukia and the Shiba, now, Byakuya spoke. While both Renji and Rukia heeded Byakuya's words, Eriniro couldn't help but smile internally. He knew exactly what was coming. Chapter 15, The Vasto of White, Part 2. What does it mean to be a brother? Was it to value the inherent love of family? Or to honor the duty passed down from generation to generation of the noble household of Kukaki? Clearly, the answer was not something he wished to dwell on. Yet prior circumstances did not allow him the ability to proceed as he wished, his own household supporting the decision made by the ruling government of the Soul Society, the Central 46. The Kukaki clan was one of 4 noble clans within the Soul Society tasked with the service of compiling and protecting the history of the Soul Society. He, as the next clan head, had his obligations to the work of all his ancestors. Tarnishing their efforts by going against the rulings of the government his family was tasked with recording in the first place, was unacceptable. Yet only now, the situation could permit him to act freely, to uphold both duty and family. It was not verbal, for he was never much of a talkative person, not since her death. Either way, he was resolved. He was the captain of Squad 6, of the 13 court guard squads, Byakuya Kukaki. More than that, he would fulfill both the promise he had made to his wife, and the expectations placed down on the name of Kukaki. He was Byakuya Kukaki, and a brother to only one. See Captain. Renji spoke in alarm, his expression displaying his confusion. After all, Byakuya had restrained everyone with his Kidu, immobilizing them and willing them towards the formed Senkaimon as a massive Gargantia began to take root in front of him. Byakuya gave Rukia a single glance, his face set into a cold mask as Rukia's features superseded with the only woman he had ever loved enough to call his wife, Rukia's sister, Hisuna Kukaki. To uphold the promise he made, he would do his utmost. The hands holding onto his sword's hilt tightened while he readied himself for battle. The opening of a Gargantia only meant a single thing for any Soul Reaper. Hollows. Brother, what about Ichigo? Rukia yelled in concern, her expression panicked. Byakuya made no motions to signal his thoughts on the matter, yet he had already decided on a course of action. There was no time to move Ichigo and Karen's bodies. Although he could somehow manage with his speed, doing so meant turning his back to the approaching hollows. And with his death, Ichigo's and Karen's would all but be guaranteed. Thus, he would at least do what he could. You should believe in your brother, Kukaki. Can you not see it, the sharpness in his stature like a drawn sword? Kyan spoke from the side, doing nothing to resist against the restraints Byakuya had placed on him, unlike Renji, who struggled in vain. "Lieutenant Kyan," Rukia said, pursing her lips. She was still in shock that Kyan was alive, but she was also greatly concerned about Ichigo. At this moment, she didn't really know what to feel. "Captain, I can fight too," Renji insisted from the side. Byakuya's eyes narrowed. "No, not this time," he spoke, spotting multiple humanoid figures walking within the tier between dimensions. "This situation is not something that someone of your current level can handle," he spoke calmly. "Instead, inform the other captains. Even when the spiritual detection squad notices a spike in the spiritual energy of a hollow, they do not possess the authority to mobilize captain-level Soul Reapers in short notice. You are my lieutenant. They will understand the gravity of the situation." Finishing his words, the Kid binding Renji immediately faded, a complex expression forming over Renji's face as he wordlessly picked up Rukia. As for Kyan, he left him bound in his Kid. He was still too suspicious. On top of being able to open a Gargantia, Kyan was also announced to be dead for several years. And now he just suddenly turned up? It was too much of a coincidence to not take any cautions. "Renji, put me down," Rukia protested as her eyes lingered on the unconscious Ichigo and Karen. "Just shut your trap," Renji muttered before quickly entering the Senkaimon with Rukia under his arm, and Kyan to his right. As soon as Renji, Kyan, and Rukia passed, the doors of the Senkaimon closed, and the portal to the Soul Society vanished into the air. Left alone, Byakuya let out a breath. The time for confrontation was fast approaching. He closed his eyes and concentrated. Requesting immediate release of spirit limiter. His transmission had an instant effect. It was likely that those in the spiritual detection squad had already detected the spike in hollow energy in the area. The energy coursing freely through his veins allowed him a momentary calm. With what he envisioned the situation would turn into, this would be his last moments to prepare himself. He opened his eyes. At that moment, his mind was collected. Possessing nothing of the insecurities and doubts that had once plagued it since the start of this retrieval mission. There was no longer a need for hesitation. There was no longer any point between deciding what was right and what was wrong. All that remained was resolve, and the will to see things through till the end. "Scatter, Senbonzakura," a simple incantation came from his mouth accompanied by a gentle breeze. The sword that had accompanied him for the entirety of his life scattered in the wind, a simple flurry of delicate pink rose petals, a shower of thousands of tiny blades. Senbonzakura, his most trusted Zanpyukuto spirit and lifelong partner, seemed to sense the change in him, dancing within the air in preparation for battle. If this were to be his end, he could only wish that he could see her once more, and bow his head in apology for his indecision. Hisuna. And with a breath, a figure appeared within the shadows of the Gargantia. Pale. Humanoid. Its aura alone was imposing. His eyes could only widen in disbelief. Vasto Lord. The strongest of all hollows. And this one, was something he had never seen before. Tall, sleek, it looked entirely human aside from the hollow bone greaves and vambraces covered in tribal marks. Around it was some sort of torn red cloth that clung to its body, making it look like one of the beggars of the Rukon district of the Soul Society. Its face was hardened, its eyes sweeping across the entirety of Karakura town before landing on him with a narrowed gleam. It didn't make sense. Vasto Lords were already rare amongst hollows, and for one to descend into the human world, it was unheard of. A being of their power would not find the spiritual energy of humans sufficient enough to maintain their forms, let alone be worthy enough to hunt. So, in the end, for what purpose did this lone Vas? His thoughts died in the recesses of his mind. It was a sound reminiscent of ripping cloth. A truly familiar one. A second Gargantia appeared in the place of the first, multiple smaller ones appearing adjacent. The first Vasto Lord, the Pale One. The Vasto of White did not appear surprised by the arrival of other hollows, but then again, when did hollows ever show expression? A sinking feeling began to form from within the pit of his stomach, a cold sweat making a shiver run down his back. This situation was too absurd. That was his first thought when he spotted the messy-haired blonde that stepped out from the void. Her entire body aside from her face was covered in hollow bone armor, with the chest region being a lighter shade of pale blue. Her eyes became fierce as soon she noticed him. He didn't know what to make of it, the growing dread from the depths of his soul. Senbonzakura condensed in on itself, creating a protective dome of flowing petals around him. If the situation had been absurd before, then surely now it had become apocalyptic. The human world could not withstand the rampage of a sole Vastolord alone, let alone two. A Vastolord was the known pinnacle of a Hollow's evolution, their combat prowess significantly higher than an average captain. Yet because of this fact, their numbers were rare and could easily be counted by the fingers of one's hand. This goes to show how strong they are. After all, a Vastolord is Hollow that had been able to consistently survive multiple life or death situations and come out on top to feast on the corpses of their enemies. This was why there were so few of them. A Hollow's path of evolution was just too savage. But the power a Vastolord possessed was undeniable. Thus, just the pressure the two were releasing was enough to cause any lesser Soul Reaper's shoulders to sag, and knees to buckle. Perhaps they may even die, crushed to death. His eyes glanced down at the two humans and Quincy near him, and he quickly made a decision. He took to the skies, placing a distance between himself and Ichigo and Karen. It was the best he could currently do for Rukia's request. From the smaller Gargantius appeared even more hollows. Ajichas, both large and small. See Captain Kukaki, the transmission device he kept on him from the spiritual detection squad crackled to life. We are detecting a massive influx of hollows in the area. What is the situation? The voice that spoke could do little to hide the panic laced within. He couldn't respond. See Captain. From within the Gargantia the blonde-haired Vastolord had come from, there appeared 5 other figures. The dread that had once filled him left, and in its place, was resignation. As a captain of the 13 court guard squads, and as a Kukaki, he would stand firm regardless of the situation. Even with the combined presence of 7 Vastolords. He swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. Captain Kukaki. The voice in the other end of the transmission device had changed, this time belonging to a male. We are detecting strange anomalies in your area, and are unable to estimate the power of 7 of them. He didn't have time to think too much on an answer, instead, transmitting his only response to the spiritual detection squad. Vastolords. There was a choked gasp on the other line before it all faded into static. By now, the spiritual detection squad should have sent word to the 1st Division. That being the case, they could not immediately mobilize the might of a captain-level Shinigami. For that, he had sent Renji as a head start. Renji's credibility would only increase with the help of the spiritual detection squad. For now, didn't know if he would survive long enough for help to arrive. Perhaps help would arrive in a few moments, but in this situation, even a couple seconds could be enough to end him. Staring off at the newly arrived 5, he could slightly discern their relative strengths to a point based off of the bearings they all represented. Amongst the 5, 3 of them appeared weaker than the other 2. The 3 standing in a close-knit formation to cover each other's weakness. Of the 2 others, one had the lower half of a horse and the body of green-haired and well-endowed woman. The other was entirely encased in hollow bone with only his face visible due to cracks on his mask's surface. On his back were bat-like wings. Almost immediately upon arrival, the 3 weaker Vastolords made their way to stand beside the messy-haired blonde. One of them was covered in smooth brown fur, her legs resembling a deer, and the long white antlers on her head making it more obvious. Currently, she was glaring at him with unconcealed contempt. Similar to her, was the lion-like Vastolord beside her. Brown-skinned and possessing long hair that looked like a mane, she had the figure of an imposing woman. The last of the 3 was slim and snake-like, sleeve-like cloth resembling the skin of a shedding snake acting as sleeves that concealed her hands beneath. Out of the 3, she was the one who was the most composed and simply stared at him through thinly veiled eyes. The Vasto of White stepped forward. He instantly raised his guard expecting a quick assault. Contrary to his belief, such a thing did not happen. I have only a single question, the Vasto of White spoke without arrogance nor demand. Instead, it was clear to see the sincerity in the Vasto of White's voice. He had never quite met a hollow like this. It was almost pleasant if he could put a word to it. However, he would not be so easily deceived. Just the aura the Vasto of White exuded alone felt suffocating. He knew that should this Vasto Lord get set off, nothing short of his full power would be able to stop him, and that was him being optimistic. Vasto Lords were on an entirely different level. As such, not once did he let his guard down despite the cordial nature the Vasto of White was displaying. "And what would you have to ask?" he questioned, eyeing the other Vasto Lords who have yet to make a move. If they all attacked him, he had little hope of surviving. Unaware, or uncaring of his internal dilemma, the Vasto of White continued on. "I have two friends who traveled down to the human world, have you seen them?" The Vasto of White asked, his expression hardening and demanding a truthful answer. Yet, he was no fool. Immediately after the Vasto of White had spoken, he had connected the dots and found the missing piece of the puzzle. The reason why so many Vasto Lords would descend to the human world. Those two. His thoughts drifted onto the words Kyan Shiba had once spoken to Mayuri Kurosuchi. "If you take her, you will regret it." Back then he had been confused and a tad bewildered due to Kyan's choice of words, but now, he understood. How much power would a single Hollow have to possess to be able to lead other Vasto Lords? What sort of figure would other Vasto Lords and Ajichas follow? Clearly it was the one before him. He did not appear to rule through suppression like the scholars in the Siriti had envisioned, but seemed to possess a charisma to him that was unmistakable. The bearings of a king and leader. This point was clear when he realized that the other Vasto Lords stood behind him. These other Vasto Lords did not come for their purposes, but to follow behind the back of one. "Have you seen them?" The Vasto of White pressed once again, probably noticing the minute change in his expression. That Demkurotsuka did not know what he had done. His features remained impassive. Like he had said, he wasn't a fool. He knew that should he admit anything, it would immediately draw the other party's ire towards the Siriti. The situation as it was, he would not be able to survive with the odds stacked against him. The most sensible course of action was honestly to retreat. Yet how could he do that and leave the human world at the hands of Vasto Lords and Ajichas? He couldn't. Thus, there was only a single option left. He would have to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Perhaps only for a minute, or maybe two. Yet at most, he already knew that even that would be difficult. Out of options, he would just have to hope for the best. The Vasto of White frowned, seeing his unwillingness to answer. "Don't waste your breath," the blonde-haired Vasto Lord stepped forward. "Soul Reapers have never been the kind to interact pleasantly with us, save for that one exception." The Vasto of White reluctantly nodded. "You will not answer?" The Vasto of White questioned once more. Met with the sincerity in the Vasto of White's voice, he could not help but at least give a response. "The situation does not allow me to permit it," he responded. The Vasto of White could take his words as he will. Whether he understands their relevance or not, it didn't matter much to him. "Then you at least know?" the Vasto of White questioned. He nodded his head. The Vasto of White made no indication to show what he thought. Instead, it was the three behind the blonde-haired Vasto Lord that reacted. "We can just beat him for the answers," the snake-like Vasto Lord suggested, drawing a hint of displeasure from the green-haired one. "He was at least truthful," the green-haired Vasto Lord rebutted. "He is a Shinigami," the snake-like Vasto Lord spoke pointedly. "How many of our kind do you think he's killed?" The green-haired Vasto Lord fell short after the snake-like Vasto's reply. "Yet we are no different," the blonde Vasto Lord answered in the green-haired Vasto Lord's stead. This rebuttal immediately silenced the snake-like Vasto Lord. The bat-like Vasto Lord kept his opinions to himself. As for the others, the deer and lion-like ones were far more vocal. And in fact, they had already moved to attack him. In which case, the blonde-haired Vasto Lord only shook her head in disapproval, yet didn't stop their actions. After all, Haribal could tell that with Shiro's personality, he would not bring himself to attack unless justified. They didn't know if Byakuya had anything to do with Silent and Lilynet. Thus, Shiro was disinclined to attack on his own accord. Already foreseeing such an event as soon as Shiro entered the Gigantia, she had followed. And as expected, it happened. At least this could serve as practice for Mila Rose and Apasai. Byakuya had already been preparing himself for an attack, and had been ready to react as soon as he saw Opasai and Mila Rose move. The dome of thousands of tiny blades began to revolve around him, his eyes flashing with a cold light. Ha, as if that could stop us. Mila Rose grunted as she formed a zero in her free hand. Opasai. TCH, fine, Opasai clicked her tongue as a wave of sharp petals flew by her. You should work on your aim, Shinigami. She taunted before halting her charge. She then spread her arms out, a dim red glow forming in between her antlers and just above her brows. Mila Rose, you better not mess this up. Byakuya's gaze shifted from both Opasai and Mila Rose. Senbonzakura. His trusted partner kicked up a storm of death, from below him, raging around like a hurricane. Haribel's eyes furrowed watching the scene. Opasai dash. Move, you idiot. Mila Rose's voice rung out louder than Haribel's. Opasai's face contorted in confusion. She had already dodged the Shinigami's attack moments earlier and was readying her own. What was there for her to worry about? The sound of cutting air reached her ears and she immediately turned around. Fuck. Her eyes widened upon seeing a wave of sword petals about to wash over her. Like the ocean, everything is swept within the waves and washed beneath. One could miss the tides, but one could never avoid it for long. Just as one wave goes past, another will appear. Scatter, Senbonzakura, Byakuya spoke decisively. His movements were fluid, the bladeless hilt of his sword pointed in Opasai's direction and willing the previous scattered petals in his first attack to return. This is what had caught Opasai by surprise. She had left her guard down by believing that she'd dodged Byakuya's attack. How was she to know that every tiny petal-like blade was under his control? Opasai, you fool! Mila Rose yelled. Opasai's brow twitched from within the hurricane of rose petals. She had heard Mila Rose's remark and was greatly unpleased with it. Even more so when she realized that many cuts were starting to form over her body. She involuntarily shivered. If she was still in Aegis, there was no way she could survive this sort of attack, yet now. You think that this is enough to stop me? Dream on! She yelled, a tower of red spiritual energy erupting from within her and surrounding her. The wounds she had sustained began to slowly heal, the regenerative properties that all hollows possessed kicking in with the addition of a surplus of spiritual energy. Zero. The blast came with the energy one would expect from a Vasto Lord. Byakuya immediately maneuvered around the blast, parts of his Haori burning away. He discarded it without another thought. The Zero had created a plume of smoke that traveled towards the air. The impact though was enough to free Opasai and send Senbonzakura's petals flying. Byakuya gripped the hilt in his hand and instantly began directing the scattered blade petals back to his side. Instantly, he was one again surrounded in protective dome, his narrowed eyes giving him the appearance of an otherworldly warrior. His noble disposition even added to the effect. His flawless demeanor and bearings already enough to cause many women in the Soul Society to swoon. For hollows though. He really pisses me off, Opasai muttered, feeling indignant that she had messed up in front of Lady Haribel. Agreed, Mila Rose spoke, still holding her Zero in hand. She was planning to somehow get in close and punch out with her Zero. However, seeing the dome of sword petals around Byakuya, she was hard-pressed to find an obvious path to victory. Originally, Mila Rose had planned to maneuver in after Opasai had distracted Byakuya with her Zero. She never would have had expected that not only would Opasai not be able to attack with her Zero, but would be forced to use it to free herself from the enemy's own attack. This Soul Reaper was quite skilled. Yet the natural advantages of Vasto Lords were apparent. Byakuya frowned. He had put in a considerable amount of strength into that last attack, and all he had to show for it were the minor cuts and lacerations around Opasai's body. Either way, she did seem hindered, or affected in the least. And this was what was troubling. If this was just the strength of one, what about the others? His eyes remained on the battlefield. Senbonzakura. He willed his Zanpakuto on once more. His defense was in no way perfect, and he would not give his opponents the time to analyze it. Byakuya's attacks were as swift as storms yet as versatile as water. Damn it! Mila Rose cursed, shifting her posture and evading the twisting reach of Senbonzakura. However, she wasn't fast enough and had to resort to using the Zero in her hand to blow apart the incoming wave of sword petals. Yet little did she know how ineffective it would be. As soon as Mila Rose had scattered the petals, they had immediately converged back in on her. Unlike Apasai, Byakuya was not willing Senbonzakura to return to him, but instructing it to continuously attack instead. Up in the distance, Nell's eyes tracked the movement of the battle before she turned to Haribal. "They've just evolved a short time ago," she stated. Haribal nodded her head. "They need this practice to understand their own limitations and develop their own experiences." Nell pursed her lips. "That's a captain-level Shinigami. They'll be in danger should they be caught off guard." Haribal uncrossed her arms. "You forget whose presence this Shinigami is fighting in. They will be fine." "Then should I go help them, Lady Haribal?" Sung Sun asked. Haribal shook her head. "You're still injured from the last battle with Grimjo. You don't heal as fast as Apasai." Sung Sun heeded Haribal's words and did not protest. Back in the battlefield, Apasai was nursing several injuries on her body, yet they weren't life-threatening. "You," she seethed. "When I get my hands on you'll wish that dash." Apasai's eye twitched as a wave of sword petals cut her off. TCH, her pupils dilated. "Mila Rose, what are you waiting for? No need to tell me." Mila Rose appeared behind Byakuya, who was focusing his attacks on Apasai. "Got you now," Mila Rose spoke while grinning, punching out with her hand. Byakuya raised a brow, before he completely disappeared in a flash step. Where? Mila Rose could not react in time as a torrent of blade petals pressed on her back and smashed her to the ground. She coughed out blood. "How?" Byakuya appeared back in the sky, his blank expression seeming to be taunting Mila Rose. Her veins bulged in her anger. What did he know of her power? If it weren't for the fact that she and Apasai were still getting used to their new strength, he would be the one on the ground. Still, the current situation was infuriating. It was two Vastolords against a single Shinigami, yet the two Vastolords were on the losing end. It was unacceptable. Although Byakuya was good, he could not escape from minor injuries. His clothes had become tattered and blood seeped over them in a scant few places. Yet overall, he was doing fine. It was only his spiritual reserves that would become a problem. Fighting against two Vastolords was indeed difficult. He had already used more than half of his reserves to keep the two at bay. Suddenly, a bright green blast set the night ablaze in a fiery green. Byakuya's eyes widened. What? His left arm fell limply by his side, his expression revealing his incredulousness as pain blossomed from his penetrated shoulder. It had been pierced by a concentrated blast of spiritual energy, much like a lance. All eyes turned to Ulquiorra, who remained unfazed. In fact, he did not believe that he had done anything wrong. "You wanted him alive, did you not?" he asked calmly. "I incapacitated one of his arms to make it easier." Ulquiorra was not wrong in his actions from the perspective of the other Vastolords, but to the cat watching in the distance, its eyes turned murderous. Even the man in the hat and clogs a great distance away from the battlefield frowned before pulling his hat further over his face. "Mila Rose, Apasai," Haribal's voice echoed out. "End it quickly." With Haribal's command, Mila Rose and Apasai's training was over. "Yes," the two responded. Byakuya pursed his lips, moving his hand away from his wounded shoulder and focusing on controlling his sword. Yet even still, he could not bring himself to fight at the same capability as he had been before. He could no longer handle the two of them on his own. Perhaps if he had had more time to train, the results would have been different, but he would never have had imagined the appearance of so many Vastolords. His arm was useless, hanging limply by his side as he utilized his speed to just barely avoid any critical blows. His head swerved to the right as a fist nearly grazed his neck. He grunted as Senbonzakura showered over him and forced the other two a distance away. Apasai appeared by Byakuya's side, annoyance written all over her face. She did not feel any pride in defeating a captain-level Shinigami like this. It was like she was simply a scavenger taking advantage of the spoils of a stronger animal. It was disheartening. "It ends here," Apasai spoke, clipping Byakuya on the shoulder with a punch. Byakuya was blown back, but she still ended up wincing in pain as hundreds of petal-like blades lacerated her entire arm. Injured as Byakuya was, there was no doubt that he was still troublesome. Blood dripped down from Apasai's fingers, trickling down from her forearms which bled the most. "You aren't looking very good, Apasai," Mila Rose jeered. "Shut it," Apasai spoke. "You're not looking so good yourself." Mila Rose breathed out through her nose, but did not refute Apasai's statement. Her body was still recovering from the damage Byakuya had been able to land before Ulquiorra had injured him. Byakuya pulled himself out from the rubble he landed in. His vision swimming, he shook his head to clear it. Blood dripped down from his temples and trickled slowly towards his chin. With a ragged breath, he once again steadied himself within the air, Senbonzakura gripped tightly in his hand. He could not understand it, why had help not yet arrived? With all his preparations, it was impossible that the Soul Society would not immediately come to his aid. Unless some unforeseen circumstances had occurred. Sweat and blood mixed and dripped down from his arm, his other injuries hampering his movements. The pain was almost unbearable, but with his upbringing within the Kukaki clan, he was highly resistant to it. Even so, he knew he had his limits. And eventually he would reach them. The situation as it was, he had no choice but to escape. His Senkaimon opened up before him. Yet would he be given the chance to pass through it? Unlikely. "You're not going anywhere," Mila Rose called, taking action exactly as Byakuya had predicted. He had been naive in this battle. Even though he had kept his eyes on the movements of the other Vasto Lords, he had underestimated just how fast their attacks were. He had paid for that mistake with one of his arms. The Senkaimon was just a short distance away from him, not even 10 meters. And yet that distance felt as if it was a mile. Not only had Apasai and Mila Rose reacted to the opening of the Senkaimon, but some of the other Ajichas who had been watching silently since the beginning began to move. "The king has not permitted you to leave, Shinigami," one of the Ajichas said. "King?" Byakuya was injured, yet that didn't mean his mind had shut down. What was a king? A king was a being who ruled. Much like the old kings of the human world, and the spirit king himself. For the hollows, Ajichas and Vasto Lord level at that, to call another hollow their king, had an organization of sorts taken root within Hueco Mundo. A single hollow to lead them all? Such a thought had untold consequences. Since hollows not only far outnumbered those of the Soul Reapers, but they had strength to even rival them. For the longest period of time, what hollows feared most were not Soul Reapers, but other hollows. This was due to the savagery of a hollow's evolution. Yet, if a ruler appeared and eliminated the infighting of hollows, how strong of a force would that be when the base strength of a Vasto Lord already exceeded that of a regular captain? Byakuya was not in the state to think of such a thing any further. His sword slashed out at those who would block his path. For a moment, he considered using his Bankai as Apasai and Mila Rose appeared in front of him. However, he knew it wouldn't be as effective when versing multiple opponents. It was even more futile knowing that the other Vasto Lords would act upon seeing Mila Rose and Apasai at a disadvantage or in danger. Thus, he would have to tough through it using other means. Sensing its master's struggle, Senbonzakura cut a path for Byakuya to follow, numerous petal-like swords forming two walls on either side of Byakuya and repelling the horde of Ajichas. Yet, such a means would never be able to stop a Vasto Lord. Apasai and Mila Rose stood before Byakuya's eyes. "Give up," was all Mila Rose said before she crossed her arms. She and Apasai could not kill Byakuya for he had the answer to their questions. At this moment, Byakuya was truly out of options. All that was left, was instinct. Bankai, Senbonzakura Kage Yoshi. To pit everything on a single attack. Regardless of his reservations of using his Bankai before and regardless if the other Vasto Lords act, this would be his only gamble. With his spiritual energy already running low, he knew that after this one attack, he would be completely spent. Still, he would have to follow through with it for it was the only thing he could do. Senbonzakura Kage Yoshi was the aspect of his Zanpakuto that focused solely on attack, discarding all forms of defense. And at this moment, he would use it for an instant to bypass the two Vasto Lords in front of him. His attack was as swift as wind. Apasai's and Mila Rose's expression became startled as they raised their arms in defense. Haribel's eyes narrowed as she sensed the danger of the coming strike and immediately tossed her blade to intercept. Byakuya was already at full swing when he sensed a searing pain in his side where a shark fin blade had stabbed into him. He gritted his teeth and ignored the pain. To attack without defense, he already knew the consequences even if he only used his Bankai so briefly that no one should have been able to discover its function. In moments, he had passed by Apasai and Mila Rose and was directly in front of the Senkaimon. Yet he could not take that last step. His energy all but left him, and his muscles stalled and refused to move. Apasai and Mila Rose were bleeding from stab wounds on their chests, but as Vasto Lords, their vitality was far higher than any Shinjami's. They would be fine with rest. But the same could not be said for Byakuya. Byakuya was resigned. He had done his best yet faltered right at the end, injured and battered. Hisuna. He knew that the Vasto Lords had the intention of capturing him after his first exchange with the Vasto of White. However, that had also been a safety measure of sorts. They would not kill him without first extracting information from him. Not only would this blunt the attacks of the Vasto Lords, but it would make it easier on him to fight without restraint. How could he have had expected that the bat-like Vasto Lord would immediately shoot through his shoulder moments after the start of the battle? "It's over, Shinigami," Apasai spoke, wiping the blood off of her mouth and reaching over for Byakuya. Yet at that moment, something incredulous occurred. Vision at the edge of unclarity, Byakuya could only make out a single image as his body began to drift into unconsciousness from within the closing Senkaimon. The guilty expression of a black cat. Elsewhere, if one were to look, the bodies of Ichigo, Karen, and Ishida were nowhere to be found. The Soul Society should have been in an uproar after word of a Vasto Lord's sighting in Karakura town. However, it was oddly peaceful. Aizen Saoshik sheathed his sword as he passed by a dazed-looking Renji Abarai and an unconscious Rukia Kukaki. His gaze then landed on Kyan Shiba. "You did well," was all Aizen spoke. Kyan clicked his tongue. "You aren't here to save me at the moment," he stated. It was quite obvious since he was still bound by chains of Kidu. "There will be use of you here rather than in Hueco Mundo," Aizen agreed. "In the meantime, I've prepared for you a reward for your efforts." Finished speaking, Aizen pulled a small black box from his sleeve and lazily placed it in front of Kyan. "You'd be surprised by the number of dead hollows you could find at the borders of the king's domain," Aizen spoke offhandedly. "They were mainly Ajichas, but I'm sure you'd be satisfied with the amount. They are stored within the box using a complex kita that only you should be able to open." Kyan's lips parted into a grin, revealing the hollow inside. Araniro Aruruari was quite pleased. To other hollows, dead hollows were not as precious, but to him who was able to absorb a dead hollow's abilities and spiritual energy, it was the equivalent to a massive gift. Not only would his strength increase, but the variety of abilities he possessed would increase as well. The ability to evolve without limit. This was Araniro's greatest power. "Then I will remain idle within the Soul Society," Kyan spoke. Aizen nodded before turning to Renji. It was about time for the hypnosis he had put him through to fade, and with it, his announcement to the division commander. In which case, it was time for Aizen to make his exit. A shrewd smile crept across his face. After he had first arrived back at the Soul Society, he had intercepted the panicked messages of the Spiritual Detection Squad requesting aid, and had altered them to report normal readings. It wouldn't do for the Soul Society to know of the startling number of Vasto Lords now present. Such a thing would upset the balance and would completely take the Soul Society's attention away for the planned execution of Rukia Kukaki. And he could not have that, now could he? Either way, masking the number of Vasto Lords he will eventually have under his control would only be a boon for him later when he eventually comes into conflict with the Soul Society. Knowing Shiro though, he would not wait before taking action. Once Shiro knew that the Soul Society had taken one of his companions, he would stop at nothing to save them. This action was proven to him moments earlier when, regardless of the consequence, Shiro had still gone to the human world. Moving by one's whims and not by logic, it was still something foreign to him. Yet, intuitively, he had already come up with several methods to utilize this behavior. With Ulquior's eye having recorded the entire scene before Shiro's arrival, He had no doubts that Shiro would learn of the events that had unfolded in a short period of time and mount an assault on the Soul Society. This action was definitely beneficial to him, but the only problem was timing. As soon as Shiro discovered what had occurred, there was no telling how soon he would be at the Soul Society's doorstep with a plan or not. In which case, he had to think of a way to delay Shiro's date of invasion, and he knew it wasn't going to be a simple matter either. With Kyoka Suijutsu's effect being useless against Shiro, he would have to implement other means. Thus, he would have to act personally to complete such objectives with finesse. Still, this was why he had one other place to visit. To delay Shiro from attacking too early, there was only a single way to appease him. Walking leisurely through the long halls of the Siratii at the center of the Soul Society, he pondered silently to himself as he reached his destination. Knocking, he waited patiently for the man who he wished to meet. This man was perhaps the entire perpetrator that had set up the catalyst to the Soul Society's precarious situation. Clearing his throat, he remained calm as an unamused face greeted him. Opening his mouth, he spoke as he placed a hand discreetly at the hilt of his sword. "Why, hello there, Captain Kuratsuke." His smile was utterly dazzling. Sung-sun nearly burst out into laughter as she witnessed Apasai and Mila Rose lose their adversary to a wandering cat that had accidentally bumped Byakuya into his own Senkaimon. Yet she knew the situation was not a laughing matter. Still, she couldn't resist spouting a jab. "Truly you two are the epitome of grace and fearlessness, but alas, to think a simple cat would be your match. How unfortunate," Sung-sun snickered. "Bitch." Apasai's brow twitched in irritation. "I didn't see you do anything." "Humph, if I had, do you think we would be having this exact conversation?" "Obviously not. Instead, we would be asking that Shinigami for answers." Apasai stewed in her own anger, wishing to yell out, but a look from Haribal silenced her. Haribal was looking at Shiro, who had not said a word since the fight with Byakuya had began. Instead, he seemed to be staring quizzically at empty air. However, it was simply because Haribal and the others could not see what Shiro was seeing. A floating armored man stood before Shiro with his arms crossed. His attire was that of a samurai with long white robes tied together by a sash by the waist. Over the man's face was a red oni mask. This floating man was precisely Senbonzakura. "Do you know where my friends are?" Senbonzakura gave a disinterested nod as he crossed his arms. This had been how Senbonzakura had been standing since the beginning of the fight between Byakuya, Apasai, and Mila Rose. "Will you tell me?" Shiro asked within his mind. Senbonzakura shook his head, saying nothing as he faded away and reappeared in a world of unlimited blades. Shiro sighed at this result. It was reminiscent of how Kyoka had acted when they had first met. He would have to make some headway somehow with Senbonzakura to get his answers. As for Byakuya, it was exactly how Haribal had guessed, but more than that. He could tell from Byakuya's personality that even if he had been captured, there was no way that the man would reveal any answers. Thus, instead of focusing on Byakuya, he had been focusing on Senbonzakura instead. Yet that did not give any results either. He sighed, already feeling worried that he could not sense Lilynet's spiritual signature, let alone silence. What had happened in this town? What should we do now? The one who spoke was Ulquiorra. Shiro didn't even need to think before he answered. "We search," he said simply. With the sheer number of Ajichas that followed him to the human world, they would be able to search the entire town within minutes of exploration. This process would only quicken with the aid of the other Vasto lords. At that moment, another voice put a stop to what Shiro had suggested. "Wait." Following the voice, all eyes turned to its owner. Coyote Starkey stepped out from a Gargantia in an unmistakable rage. Held in one of his arms was an unconscious Lilynet, and in the other, an eyeball. "What is going on?" Check the description for the links to the author.